She had stopped counting the nights she fell asleep alone in a bed large enough to swallow her whole. That was the first thing anyone needed to understand about Serena Vale. Not the woman she became after, but the woman she was before. The one who ironed her husband's collar with bare hands because she wanted to feel useful to him. The one who rehearsed conversations in mirrors, adjusting her posture, softening her smile, lowering the pitch of her voice, as though love were a performance she hadn't yet mastered. 7 years. 7 years of that performance, and she never once questioned whether the audience had stopped watching. She was still on stage when the curtain fell on her. She just didn't know it yet. This is the story of what happens when a woman finally stops begging and a man finally starts bleeding. Stay until the end. What comes next is not what either of them expected. Chet. The morning of the 15th of March arrived the way most mornings did at Ashford Hall. Gray, indifferent, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Serena woke before the household stirred. She always did. There was a particular discipline in that habit, cultivated not from ambition, but from survival. If she was already awake and moving when the rest of the estate came to life, she didn't have to lie in the silence of that enormous bedroom wondering whether her husband had come home the night before. She didn't have to listen for footsteps in the corridor. She didn't have to decide whether to hope. She dressed herself. She had long stopped waiting for the lady's maid to do it, not because the girl was incompetent, but because Serena had learned that the act of dressing, of fastening each button with deliberate fingers, of pulling her hair back with practiced calm, was one of the few things in this house that she could control entirely. She stood before the mirror only long enough to confirm that nothing was visibly wrong with her, and then she left the room. The hall was dim, gaslight still burning low from the night before, which meant someone had forgotten to extinguish them, which meant the senior housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, would have words about it at breakfast with the junior staff while pretending the oversight hadn't cost money they didn't need to waste. Serena noted it and moved on. She noted most things and moved on. It was the only way the estate functioned. She descended the main staircase and turned left toward the study, because the study was where the account ledgers lived, and the account ledgers were what kept this household from collapse. And collapse was something Serena had been quietly preventing for 6 of the 7 years she had spent here. Not loudly. Never loudly. Damian Ashford did not appreciate loudness from her, particularly not the kind that reminded him of his own failures. The study door was open. She stopped. It was never open at this hour. She pushed it wider and found him inside. Damian Ashford, the 8th Duke of Westhaven, stood with his back to the door. He was still dressed in his evening clothes from the night before, the jacket discarded somewhere behind the desk, the white shirt untucked and creased at the back in a way that told her he had not slept. He was standing at the window, one hand braced against the frame, staring out at the gray morning grounds with the expression she had spent years trying to read and had never quite managed. Not anger, not grief, not anything she could name with confidence. Just the particular blankness of a man who had taught himself not to feel things in front of people. She had made the mistake, early in their marriage, of finding that quality compelling. "You're back," she said. Not a question, not warmth, just acknowledgement. He turned his head, not his whole body, just enough to see her in his peripheral vision. Evidently. She crossed the room to the desk and pulled the upper left drawer open, retrieving the household expense file she had come for. Her hands did not tremble. She was proud of that, in the quiet way she was proud of most things she couldn't share with anyone. "There's a meeting with Lord Hargrove this afternoon," she said. "I've prepared the necessary documents. The East Wing tenancy dispute needs a signature before the end of the week, and the quarterly report for the Merchants' Exchange was supposed to be submitted yesterday." He turned from the window then, fully. His eyes moved to her with something between assessment and irritation, the way they always did when she recited his obligations back to him, as though she were a secretary who had exceeded the terms of her employment. "I'm aware," he said. "The documents are on the left side of the desk. Signed copies need to be with Hargrove's office by 3. "Serena." She looked up. "I said I'm aware." The silence between them was the kind that had its own texture, dense and practiced. She had learned not to try to break it with apology or softness, because both of those things only made him look at her with something that wasn't quite contempt, but was close enough to wound. "Of course," she said. I'll have the carriage ready at 2. She took the file and left the room. She did not allow herself to feel anything until she reached the back corridor near the kitchen, where the staff didn't gather this early, and the stone walls were thick enough to swallow sound. She stood there for a moment with the file pressed against her chest and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her mother had taught her when she was 8 years old, and learning that the world did not care whether you needed more time. 7 years, she thought. 7 years and you still do this. You still walk out of rooms and find a wall to stand against and teach yourself to need nothing. She pushed away from the wall and went to handle the morning. Chant. The estate itself was extraordinary. That was a fact Serena had never been able to stop appreciating, even when everything else made appreciation difficult. Ashford Hall sat on 1,200 acres of northern coastal land, the kind of landscape that looked like it had been arranged by someone who understood drama. Chalk cliffs to the east, managed woodland to the west, the long formal gardens that Serena had spent 3 years restoring from a state of elegant neglect into something that actually functioned. The house was late Georgian, 4 stories of pale stone with a central portico and east and west wings that had been added at different periods by different Ashfords with different ideas about grandeur. It was the kind of house that required constant management to keep it from becoming a monument to entropy. And Serena had become, without anyone formally acknowledging it, the person responsible for that management. Damian had inherited the estate and the duchy at 22, following the sudden death of his father under circumstances the family had never fully discussed in her presence. He had inherited also the debts his father had accumulated with characteristic aristocratic carelessness, the political entanglements that came with a seat in the upper chamber, and a reputation for coldness that the polite world had transformed into a kind of legend. The Duke of Westhaven was not a man who loved things. He was a man who owned them and administered them and occasionally wielded them, but love, affection, warmth, the ordinary vulnerabilities of human attachment, these were qualities that seemed to have been engineered out of him somewhere along the way. Serena had been 23 when she married him. She had known his reputation. She had been told, by her mother, by her aunt, by 2 older women at her engagement dinner who had clearly meant kindly, that she should manage her expectations. She had nodded and smiled and privately believed that she would be different. Not because she was special, though she had been young enough then to believe she might be, but because she had genuinely loved him. With the pure, consuming, slightly reckless love of a woman who had looked at a difficult man and decided, without sufficient evidence, that the difficulty was worth it. She had been wrong. Not in the dramatic way of fictions, no violence, no cruelty of the obvious kind, no betrayal she could have pointed to in a court and said, "Here, this is where he broke the contract." What Damian had done to her was quieter, and in some ways more corrosive. He had simply never arrived. He had married her and then continued being exactly himself, remote, absorbed in his own obligations and ambitions, capable of charm in social settings, and capable of nothing at all in private. He spoke to her about the estate. He spoke to her about household matters and the occasional political event she was required to attend on his arm. He did not speak to her about anything that lived beneath the surface. He did not ask what she thought about things. He did not notice when she was tired. He did not reach for her in the night. In the first year, she had tried to change this through effort. She had learned his preferences, curated his environment, made herself indispensable in every practical way she could imagine. He had accepted all of it with the same mild acknowledgement he gave to a well-run kitchen. In the 3rd year, she had tried to change it through directness. She had sat across from him in this very study and told him, as calmly as she could manage, that she needed more from him, that she needed him to be present, that she needed to feel, occasionally, as though she mattered to him beyond her utility. He had looked at her with the expression she still couldn't name and said, "I married you, Serena. What more is there?" She had not asked again. The name that had been circling the household for 3 months was Lady Corinna Voss. Serena had first heard it from the footman who overheard it in the wrong corridor, then from Mrs. Pruitt, with her eyes carefully averted, then from her own social correspondence, where 2 separate women had written to her in the careful coded language that polite society used when it wanted to warn a wife without saying the word directly. Lady Corinna Voss was 28, recently widowed, possessed of significant beauty, and the particular social intelligence that came from being raised in a family that had been managing appearances for generations. Her late husband had been a close associate of Damian's. She had appeared in their social circle not long after the funeral, which was perfectly appropriate and unremarkable, and had proceeded to become something less unremarkable over time. Serena did not know with certainty what Damian's relationship with Lady Voss was. She was not by temperament someone who catastrophized in advance of evidence. What she knew was that Damian spoke of her with a quality of animation he reserved for almost nothing else, that he had attended 3 of the same dinner parties in her orbit in the span of 6 weeks, and that on 2 occasions Serena had walked into a room and watched something shift in his expression in a way she recognized from 7 years of close observation. He looked at Lady Voss the way he had never looked at his wife. That was the truth of it. Serena had identified it without ceremony, the way you identify weather. The sky looks like rain. The man looks at her differently. These were simply facts to be absorbed and navigated. What she did not yet know was that there would be a moment arriving soon from which she would not recover into patience. The dinner was Lord Alderton's, given at his townhouse on the occasion of his second son's engagement. It was a significant event in the social calendar. 60 guests, formal seating, the kind of occasion where what was said in public mattered to reputations for years afterward. Serena attended in a gown of deep green silk that she had selected with care, because everything she did for these occasions was done with care. She sat 2 places from her husband at the long table, as protocol demanded, and conducted herself with the composure she had spent 7 years developing into something very close to automatic. Lady Corinna Voss was seated across the table and 3 places to the right. Serena did not watch them. She was practiced at not watching things she didn't want to see. She engaged in conversation with Lord Pembury on her left, who was discussing a proposed drainage scheme for the northern districts with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely believed drainage was interesting, and she gave him enough of her attention to be present and enough of the rest of it to monitor the room the way she always did. The trouble began at the end of the 3rd course. She heard the name before she understood the context. Her own name, spoken at sufficient volume to carry, in a tone she didn't immediately recognize. She turned and found that the exchange happening 4 seats down had grown louder than the speaker had perhaps intended, or perhaps had intended exactly this. In these rooms it was sometimes impossible to tell. Lord Pemberton, a man of 60 with the social instincts of a much younger and less careful person, was holding court on the subject of the Ashford estate accounts. He had been drinking since before dinner. He had also, apparently, come into possession of certain information about the East Wing tenancy dispute, information that was not inaccurate, but that had been stripped of context in a way that made the handling of it sound incompetent. Of course, the whole affair would have been resolved months ago, Pemberton was saying, with the cheerful authority of someone repeating a thing he'd heard and decided to believe, if the estate management had been properly overseen. The Duchess has been running those accounts, hasn't she? One wonders whether anyone was actually watching. The table had gone slightly quieter, in that particular way tables went quiet when they sensed exposure. Serena set down her fork. She was watching Damian. She watched him hear his name adjacent to the remark. She watched his face process it. She watched him look down the table at her, briefly, and she waited for what she had told herself against evidence that he would one day do, defend her, correct the record, exercise the basic social obligation of a husband to his wife. He looked back at Pemberton. "The tenancy dispute has been handled," Damian said. His voice was its usual register, measured, unhurried, entirely without heat. "The accounts are sound." A beat. "It's a complicated estate to manage," he continued. "One can't always expect—" He paused. The pause was very small, almost imperceptible. Almost. "Precision across every aspect." Pemberton chuckled. The table breathed. The moment resolved into something acceptable to everyone present except Serena, who sat with her hands flat on either side of her plate and understood with a clarity that was almost physical exactly what had just happened. He had defended the estate. He had not defended her. The distinction had been precise enough to be deliberate, and the people at this table were intelligent enough to have registered it, and some of them would remember it, and the ones who remembered it would speak of it, and the speaking of it would become the version of her that circulated. The Duchess, whose own husband acknowledged that one couldn't expect precision from her. Lady Voss, across the table, had her eyes on her wineglass. She had the expression of a woman who had not engineered this, but was comfortable enough with the outcome not to object to it. Serena picked up her fork and continued eating. She did not look at her husband again for the rest of the evening. They rode home in the carriage in silence. It was not unusual for them to ride in silence. They had spent 7 years perfecting a marital silence that covered almost every circumstance. But this silence had a different quality, and Serena suspected that even Damian, with his considerable gifts for ignoring things, could feel it. She was sitting across from him, back to the horses, watching the lantern-lit street past the window. She was very carefully not thinking about anything. She had become skilled at this, at emptying herself of feeling the way you emptied a vessel, methodically, not because the feeling wasn't real, but because feeling it right now would accomplish nothing useful. He spoke first, which surprised her. "Pemberton talks without thinking," he said. "You know that." She looked at him. "Yes." "It wasn't worth a response." "I didn't respond. I meant my response. It wasn't worth one." He said it with the tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone who needed the explanation. Engaging with it would have elevated it. She held his gaze for a moment. "Is that what you were doing?" "What?" "Not engaging." The carriage jolted over a rut. A gas lamp outside threw brief light through the window across his face, and she saw the slight tightening of his jaw that meant she had said something that inconvenienced him. "You managed the tenancy dispute correctly," he said. "That's what matters." "Of course." "Pemberton's opinion is irrelevant." "Of course." "Then I don't understand what you're—" "I'm not doing anything, Damian." Her voice was calm. She was very proud of how calm her voice was. "I'm sitting in a carriage." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she couldn't name. Then he looked out the window. They completed the journey in silence. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the large bed in the room that had always been too large and too quiet, and stared at the ceiling and for the first time in a long time let herself think about it without managing the thinking. 7 years. 7 years of a marriage that had never become what she had understood a marriage to be. Not in the vague romantic sense, she had let go of the romantic sense in year 2, but in the fundamental sense of partnership, of basic regard, of the ordinary acknowledgement that a person standing beside you in the world is worth defending in public when someone diminishes them. She was 30 years old. She had given this house her youth and her competence and her silence, and 7 years of nights alone in a bed that fit 2 people and was occupied by 1. She had organized his estate and managed his accounts and attended his functions and stood at his side at events he didn't invite her to and smoothed his social path and absorbed his indifference with the patience of someone who had decided a long time ago that patience was the only strategy available. And tonight, when it had cost him nothing, to simply not throw her to a room full of people who would remember it, he had chosen the path that protected his own ease. She thought about Lady Voss. She thought about the way Damian had looked across the table at her, the slight animation in his face, the quality of his attention. She had been watching him carefully for 7 years. She knew what his attention looked like when he actually gave it. She had simply learned to live without it, directed at herself. The ceiling told her nothing useful. She got up before dawn and went to the study. The document was not difficult to find. She had known where it was for 2 years, not because she had been planning anything, but because she was a woman who managed an estate and knew where every important document lived: the marriage settlement, the entail provisions, the deed records. And the other thing she had placed there herself 3 months ago, when something in her had shifted into a state of quiet that felt less like peace and more like preparation. A document she had had drawn up by a solicitor in the city under a name that was technically hers but that she rarely used. A solicitor who had not asked many questions and had charged her a fair fee for the preparation. Divorce papers. She sat at the desk with them in front of her. She did not feel dramatic. That was the most honest thing she could report about the moment. There was no crescendo, no breaking point, no single overwhelming wave of the kind that fictions love to describe. There was simply a woman sitting at a desk in the gray pre-dawn light of a house that had never quite become her home, looking at a piece of paper that represented a door, and asking herself with complete seriousness whether she was prepared to walk through it. She thought about what she had here, the estate she managed, the staff who respected her, the social position that attached to the title, the version of herself that had been built entirely around the project of making this marriage work. She thought about what she didn't have, everything else. She found a pen. Desad. She heard him on the stairs at 6:30. His footsteps were distinct to her. She had learned the sound of him moving through this house the way you learned any sound you heard every day without deciding to. She had been sitting in the study for over an hour by then. The papers were on the desk in front of her. Her hands were folded. He opened the study door and stopped when he saw her. He looked at the desk. He looked at her hands. He looked at the document. For a moment he was perfectly still in the doorway with the early light behind him, and she watched something move through his face. Not quite recognition, not quite alarm, but something between them, something she hadn't seen before. "What is that?" he said. Not a question, the grammar of a question with the weight of something else. "You know what it is," she said. He crossed the room in 4 steps, the way he moved when he wasn't bothering with composure, fast and direct, and with the physical authority that he usually suppressed under the careful architecture of his public manner. He put one hand on the desk and looked down at the papers, and she watched him read the heading, watched his face process it, watched the controlled surface of him develop a crack so narrow most people would have missed it. She didn't miss it. She had been studying that face for 7 years. "No," he said. The word was very flat. "Damian, no." He straightened, and now the crack was closing, the composure reassembling, which was exactly what she had expected and exactly what she was done with. "This is—" He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "Where did you even have this drawn up?" "It doesn't matter." "It matters because—" He caught himself, breathed. She watched him select a register. "Serena, last night is one evening." She kept her voice even. Not cold. She wasn't cold. She was something else, something she didn't have a word for yet. "Last night is one evening in 7 years of evenings. Nothing happened last night. You let Pemberton imply that I was managing this estate incompetently," she said, "in front of 60 people, and you chose your words carefully enough that you didn't correct him, only softened the room, and then you told me in the carriage that it wasn't worth a response, and you believe that. I understand that you believe that." She paused. "That's the problem. Not that you did it, that you genuinely believe it didn't matter." He looked at her. The expression she couldn't name had changed. It was not the same blankness. There was something in it she hadn't seen before, and she held it in her awareness without letting it move her. "Put the pen down," he said. His voice had dropped. "We'll talk about this. Properly, not like this." "When?" she said. "When would we talk about it properly?" "Serena." "Because I have been here," she said quietly, "for 7 years, waiting for the proper time. I have waited for you to be less busy and less tired and less absorbed in whatever you were absorbed in. I have waited for the season to change and the political session to end and the next crisis to resolve. I have been very patient, Damian." She paused. "I'm done being patient." He stared at her. Something moved in his eyes, something quick and then suppressed, the way a man suppressed things when he was afraid of them. "If you sign that," he said, "you lose everything." She looked at him for a long, clear moment. "I know," she said, and she picked up the pen. She signed it with the particular deliberateness of a woman who had thought about this action for longer than anyone would know, and had decided in the end that the loss of everything she had was preferable to the continuation of a life that had cost her something she hadn't been able to name until now. The pen moved across the paper and the signature dried, and she set the pen down. Damian had not moved. He was standing on the other side of the desk with both hands at his sides, and an expression she had never seen on his face in 7 years of close observation. Not blankness, not irritation, not the remote authority he deployed like weather. Something that might have been, if she had allowed herself to interpret it that way, the expression of a man watching something slip past the point of retrieval. You can have the solicitor contact yours, she said. She stood. I'll have my things out of the house by the end of the month. The account files are organized, everything is labeled. Whoever manages the estate after me will find it in order. She walked toward the door. Serena. She stopped. Did not turn. Where will you go? She stood in the doorway with the gray morning light coming through the windows and felt, for the first time in 7 years, something that was not patience and not hope, and not the particular disciplined numbness she had built as a survival mechanism. Something lighter than all of those things. Something that had no name yet, but felt like the beginning of one. I haven't decided yet, she said. She walked out of the study. Behind her, in the house that had never become her home, the door stood open and the papers sat on the desk, and the 8th Duke of Westhaven stood absolutely motionless in a silence that was, for the first time in 7 years, entirely of his own making. She did not look back. She was finally done with looking back. What she did not know, could not have known, standing in that corridor with the estate breathing quietly around her, and the first honest sense of direction she had felt in years pulling her forward, was that 30 seconds after she left the room, Damian Ashford would cross to the desk, pick up the signed document, and stand there reading it with an expression that the portrait of his father on the opposite wall, had it been capable of judgment, might have described as the specific face of a man who had believed, without evidence, that he was permanent, and had just understood that he was not. She did not know that he would fold the document carefully and place it inside his jacket. She did not know that he would not submit it. She did not know that he would spend the next 48 hours doing what he had never done in his adult life, asking questions about her, asking the housekeeper how long she had been waking before the household, asking the estate solicitor what she had actually accomplished with the tenancy dispute, asking, in a way that alarmed the solicitor considerably, whether anyone had ever told her that she was doing well. She did not know that on the 3rd day he would go to the study and open the upper left drawer and find it empty, because she had already come and taken everything she needed, and that he would stand there with his hand on the empty space where the files had been and feel something in his chest that he had no language for because he had spent 34 years making sure he never needed that language. She did not know any of this. She was packing, and somewhere at the back of her mind, moving through her like the first light of a season she had almost forgotten existed, was a coast she had heard about once, a coastal city with a harbor market and cheap commercial space, and no one who knew her as the Duchess of Westhaven. She was 30 years old, and she had run an estate and managed accounts and held a difficult man's world together while he looked past her at other things, and she was done with that particular education now and ready for a different one. She folded her mother's brooch into the linen at the top of the travel case. She closed the latch. She walked to the door. And in the room down the hall where she had spent 7 years of nights alone, the gas lamp was still burning, the one she had left on this morning without meaning to, and that no one had come to extinguish, and that would burn until the oil ran out, quiet and purposeless and illuminating absolutely nothing. It was, she thought, a fitting thing to leave behind. The travel case weighed less than she expected. That was the first thing Serena noticed when the footman lifted it onto the carriage, how light it was. 7 years in a house, and the sum of what she was taking fit into 2 cases and a hat box. She had left behind the gowns that had been purchased for his functions. She had left behind the jewelry he had given her on the 2 occasions he had given her anything, both of them anniversaries, both of them selected by his secretary and delivered with a card signed in his own hand only because she had once, in year 2, mentioned that she preferred it. She had left behind the portrait that had been commissioned after the wedding and that hung in the upper gallery and that she had never been able to look at without feeling the specific discomfort of seeing herself rendered as a possession. She took her mother's things, her books, her correspondence files, the personal ones, the 3 gowns she had bought with her own pin money in the city last autumn, before this decision had fully formed, when it had still been only a shape at the back of her mind that she hadn't named yet. She stood beside the carriage in the gray morning and did not look up at the house. The coachman, Aldrich, who had been with the estate for 11 years and who had driven her to the city and back more times than either of them had counted, stood at the horses' heads with his hat in his hands. He was 63, and he had the face of a man who had seen a great deal and learned to keep it to himself. and when she met his eyes, he gave her a single nod, slow and unambiguous, that communicated more than a speech would have. "The 11 o'clock to the coast," she said. "Please." "Yes, Your Grace." She got into the carriage. She did not correct the title. There would be time for that later. Right now there was only the sound of the wheels on the gravel drive and the gray sky and the particular quality of air that came with leaving a place you had convinced yourself was permanent. She did not cry. She was noting this without judgment, the way she had learned to note most things about herself, factually, without narrative. She was not crying. Whether that meant she was stronger than she had thought or more hollowed out than she realized was a question she didn't have the energy for yet. The gates of Ashford Hall passed the window. She watched them go and turned to face forward. Damian found the study empty at 8:30. Not just her. The files were gone. The upper left drawer, the second shelf of the cabinet behind the desk, the small locked box she had kept on the window ledge that he had never asked about, and that he understood now with the particular clarity that arrived too late, had contained things she considered hers. The desk had been cleared to a state of professional neutrality. What remained was organized and labeled with the precision of someone who had known this moment was coming and had prepared for it as she prepared for everything, methodically, without drama, with a thoroughness that left nothing to chance. He stood in the middle of the room. Mrs. Pruitt appeared in the doorway. He did not look at her. "When did she leave?" he said. 7:30, Your Grace." "Which direction?" A beat. "I wouldn't know, Your Grace." He looked at her then. She was a woman of 55 who had managed this household's domestic affairs for 8 years, and who had, he understood in this moment, managed them as well as she had partly because of the woman who had just left in a carriage. Her face was composed in the careful arrangement of a senior servant who had opinions she had not been asked for. "Find out," he said. "Your Grace, find out which direction the carriage went, today." She left without another word. He turned back to the desk. The signed document was still in his jacket pocket, had been there since that morning in the gray light when he had watched her pick up the pen with the steadiness of someone who had been holding steadiness in reserve for a long time and had finally spent it on something it was worth spending it on. He had not expected steadiness. He was trying now to be honest with himself about what he had expected, because honesty was the only instrument available to him, and he was unused to using it in this direction. He had expected her to want something from it. Leverage, attention, the things she had been trying to get from him for 7 years through patience and management and proximity. He had expected this to be another form of asking. He had not expected her to simply mean it. He pulled the document from his jacket and looked at it. Her signature was clear and unhurried. No trembling, no second thoughts visible in the ink. He had known her handwriting for 7 years, and he could not find a single mark of hesitation in it. He folded it and put it back. The coastal train took 4 hours. Serena had a compartment to herself for the first 2, which was fortunate because she spent most of that time sitting very still and looking out the window and doing the particular kind of thinking that required not being observed. Not planning. She wasn't ready for planning yet. The planning would come later, and she was already aware it would come quickly because she was who she was, but a different kind of processing, an accounting, the ledger of a life tallied honestly. What she had, what she had spent, what remained. What remained was considerable, and she was only beginning to understand that because she had spent 7 years measuring herself in relation to a man who had never given her an accurate reflection. She had the education her father had insisted on, which was more thorough than fashionable at the time, and which had given her, among other things, a facility for financial reasoning that she had spent the last 6 years applying to an estate that was not hers. She had the experience of running that estate, not nominally, not as a duchess performing decorative administration, but actually running it. The accounts, the tenancy management, the supplier negotiations, the quarterly reports that had been filed under Damian's name because that was the convention, because that was how these things worked, because the world she had been born into did not place a woman's name on a financial document without footnoting it. She had money, not a great deal, but sufficient. The pin money she had spent carefully, and the small inheritance from her aunt that she had kept in her own name because something in her had known not consciously, but in the way the body knows things before the mind catches up, that she should not put everything inside a structure she didn't control. She had no children. That was a grief she had stopped visiting regularly because visiting it regularly was not sustainable. But she was aware of it as a fact in the ledger. She was 30 years old. She was not old. The grief was real, and the fact was also real. And she could hold both without being destroyed by either. She had herself. Serena Vale, née Hartwell, who had been competent and patient and entirely underestimated for 30 years, and who was currently sitting on a train headed for a city where no one knew her name, and who felt, under the practical accounting and the tiredness and the particular sorrow of a decision that was right and costly at the same time, something that she was going to call possibility, because that was the most accurate word available. A man boarded the compartment at the second stop. He was 50, prosperous, the kind of traveler who spread his papers across an adjacent seat with unconscious entitlement. He looked at her twice, once to assess whether she was worth noticing, and once because her face, she had been told, was the kind that made a second look feel involuntary, and then addressed her with the comfortable assumption of a man who had never been wrong about his own welcome. "Traveling far?" "Far enough," she said, and opened her book, and he had the intelligence to take the answer as what it was. Port Calvern was a coastal city of 40,000, built around a deep natural harbor that had made it prosperous for 200 years and eccentric for somewhat longer. It had a working port district that smelled of salt and fish and industry in a way that was nothing like the managed countryside of Ashford, a commercial quarter that was undergoing the kind of expansion that happened when a city was growing faster than it had planned for, and a residential district on the western cliffs that had been developed in the last 30 years for the people who had made money in the port and wanted to live above it. It also had, through the connections of her aunt, who had spent her later years there, and whose letters Serena had saved for a different reason than sentiment, a solicitor named Mr. Carr, who handled commercial property transactions without requiring her to have a husband's co-signature, because Port Calvern operated under a municipal charter with slightly more progressive provisions than the rest of the country, and Mr. Carr had never once in his 40-year career allowed convention to complicate a paying client's business. She had written to him 3 weeks ago from Ashford, using her given name and the title she would not be using much longer. He met her at the solicitor's office on Merchant Lane, a compact man of 60 with alert eyes and the manner of someone who understood that time was the one non-renewable resource. "Mrs. Vale," he said. She had used the name she intended to use. "Mr. Carr, thank you for seeing me promptly. You described the project clearly in your letter. I appreciate clients who can do that." He led her through to a back office with a window that faced the harbor and spread 3 property listings on the table. "The commercial space market on the harbor side has been moving quickly. These 3 are still available as of this morning. The rest of what you saw in the correspondence has been taken." She sat and looked at the listings, 2 warehouses and a street-level commercial property with a second-floor apartment. "This one," she said, pointing to the street-level property. He looked at her. "You haven't asked the price." "I read the listings you sent. I know the price. It's within my available capital, with a margin for renovation." She looked at him. "The margin is sufficient?" "It is, if you're realistic about the renovation scope." "I'm very realistic," she said. "What's the earliest I can take possession?" He almost smiled. "End of the week, if the survey comes back clean." "Schedule it." She stayed at a boarding house on Anchor Street for the first 4 days. The room was small and slightly damp, and the woman who ran it, a widow named Mrs. Fenwick, made breakfast at 7 sharp and considered it a personal failing if a tenant wasn't at the table. Serena was always at the table. She was grateful for the requirement. Left to herself, she suspected she would have skipped eating entirely and worked through mornings with the particular focused monomania that she recognized as her own coping mechanism. Bury yourself in the task. Don't leave room for the thing underneath the task to surface until you're ready for it. She wasn't ready for it yet. Not the grief, not the full accounting of what she had lost. She had the immediate logistics, which were real and demanding and which suited her nature. The property survey, the commercial licensing, the conversation with Mr. Carr about what Port Calvern's commercial landscape actually looked like, for a woman intending to open an import coordination business. Because that was what she was going to do, had decided to do, had been thinking about doing for 2 years while she managed Ashford's accounts, and discovered that the part she found most alive was the supply chain negotiation, the vendor relationships, the quarterly forecasting that she had done so well that no one had noticed it was her doing it at all. On the 3rd day, she wrote to her mother, a short letter, factual, the kind she knew her mother would appreciate because her mother was a woman who had spent her own life navigating within constraints and had always had more respect for pragmatism than dramatics. She explained what she had done. She explained where she was. She said that she was well, that she had money, that she had a plan, and that she would write again when the plan was further along. She did not say that she was frightened because she wasn't exactly. What she was acutely aware of her own exposure. A woman alone in a city she didn't know, with capital that was sufficient but not comfortable, about to attempt something that the world she had come from considered inappropriate at best, and evidence of a defective character at worst. She sealed the letter and went back to her figures. Damian received the solicitor's notification on the 8th day. He was in the city by then, which was where he went when he didn't know what to do with himself, because the city offered the particular anesthesia of occupation, meetings, obligations, the political machinery that required his presence and input and that had the virtue of being loud enough to cover other sounds. He had been in 3 committee sessions and 2 dinners and 1 conversation with his personal solicitor that had accomplished nothing except confirming that the document she had signed was valid and complete, and that his options were either to countersign and submit it or to not countersign and not submit it, in which case the matter was suspended in a legal limbo that resolved nothing for either party but that gave him, technically, time. He was using the time poorly. He was aware of this. The notification from Mr. Carr's office came through a chain of inquiries that he had set in motion without fully deciding to, asking his own solicitor to track the name, and the name traced to a commercial property registration in Port Calvern, and the registration traced to a filing under her maiden name, with a business designation that told him, with a precision that felt almost offensive in its clarity, that she had not gone somewhere to recover or reconsider. She had gone somewhere to build something. He stood at the window of his city apartment and looked at the street below and felt something he didn't have a name for. She had been planning this, not impulsively, not in the aftermath of the dinner and the carriage and the morning in the study. She had been planning it before all of those things. The solicitor, the name, the capital she had saved, the city she had chosen. She had been building an exit while she was still managing his estate, while she was still ironing. He stopped on that thought, because it had come from something Mrs. Pruitt had said in a passing comment that he had absorbed without processing at the time, and that had surfaced now with a quality of accusation he didn't know how to deflect. While she was still ironing his collar, while she had been doing all of it, she had not left on impulse, she had left on conclusion. He picked up his hat and left the apartment. He did not go to Port Calvern. Not yet. He was not a man who acted without understanding the position he was acting from, and his position right now was poor. He understood that with the same honest clarity he had been applying to everything since the morning of the study, because that morning had cracked something open in him that he couldn't close, and the light coming through the crack was uncomfortable, but it was the first accurate light he had seen in some time. He went instead to his club, because his club was where information moved, and information was what he was short on. He found Lord Alderton in the reading room, which was where Alderton spent most of his afternoons when Parliament was in recess, and which meant he was available for conversation if approached in the right register. Westhaven. Alderton lowered his paper. He was 60, sharp, the kind of social intelligence that read rooms for pleasure. His eyes moved across Damian's face with the brief assessing flicker that most people missed. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." 4 days. "Near enough." He set the paper down. "Sit." Damian sat. The room was quiet, the afternoon fire burning low, 2 other men absorbed in newspapers at the far end. "She's left," Damian said. Alderton was quiet for a moment. "I heard." "What did you hear?" "What I hear at any dinner in the last week, that the Duchess has gone to visit family, which is what people say when the actual story hasn't been confirmed yet." He looked at Damian with something careful in his expression. Is the actual story different? She filed for divorce. Alderton was still for a beat. Have you countersigned? No. Then it's not filed. It's pending. He picked up his glass. What do you want, Westhaven? Information or advice? Information first. The dinner. Alderton set the glass down. Pemberton's comment, I want you to understand something about what happened in that room. The people there, the ones who matter, socially, politically, they noticed what you did, or more precisely, what you didn't do. He paused. Your wife has been managing that estate for 6 years in a way that a great many people in this circle have been watching with considerable respect. Not the kind of respect that gets stated aloud. The quiet kind. The kind that accumulates. Damian looked at him. You let Pemberton hang her in public, Alderton said, not unkindly. And you dressed it as neutrality. People noticed the dressing. I didn't intend. Intent is a private thing. Behavior is public. He shrugged, the shrug of a man who had been in politics long enough to know that the distinction was the only one that mattered. What do you actually want from this, Damian? Because that's the question you haven't answered yet, and until you do, you're moving without direction. Damian looked at the fire. I want her to come back. Why? The question hit him with a directness he hadn't expected from Alderton, who was usually more oblique. Because he stopped. He was reaching for the answer that was available, the one about the estate and the household and the logistics, and he knew even as he reached for it that it was the wrong answer and that Alderton would know it was the wrong answer and that using it would cost him something. Because she was the only person in that house who was actually present, he said. Alderton looked at him for a long moment. Then you have a problem, he said, because you treated presence like furniture. And furniture doesn't notice when it's being taken for granted, but people do. The commercial property on Harbor Lane had good bones. That was the first thing the builder, a Port Calvern man named Grist, said when he walked the space with Serena on the 9th day. Good bones. The structure was sound, the second-floor apartment was functional, if unglamorous. The street-level floor had been used as a shipping broker's office for 12 years and had the particular quality of a space that understood its own purpose. The renovation she needed was cosmetic and organizational. Partition walls, proper filing infrastructure. A front office that communicated competence to the clients she intended to attract. Timeline, she said. 3 weeks for the main work. 1 more for finishing. 2.5 for the main work, she said. Same finishing week. I'll pay the premium for the faster schedule. Grist looked at her the way men in his profession looked at women who stated numbers directly. A brief recalibration, not hostile, but needing a moment. I'd need to bring in an extra man. Then bring one. I want to be operational by the 1st of next month. He gave her a price and she negotiated it down by 8%, which she had known she could do because she had priced the labor market in Port Calvern before she arrived. He shook her hand at the end of it with the manner of a man who had revised a first impression and found the revision satisfactory. She went upstairs to the apartment that night and sat on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet and ate bread and hard cheese from the provisions she'd bought at the harbor market and looked out the window at the lights of the port and felt, alongside the exhaustion and the very real fear she was no longer pretending wasn't there, something that she recognized from very early in her life, before Ashford, before the marriage, before the 7 years of herself spent managing someone else's inheritance. The feeling of something being entirely hers, the weight of a thing that would succeed or fail entirely on her own competence, and that would bear her name, and that would not be filed under someone else's. It was terrifying, and it was also, in a way she couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't been where she had been, the first thing she had felt in years that was completely clean. On the 14th day, a letter arrived at the boarding house address she had given her mother. She knew the handwriting before she opened it. She had known it for 7 years. She set it on the windowsill and looked at it for a long moment, and then picked it up and opened it with the letter knife she kept for the purpose, because she was a woman who opened correspondence with a letter knife and not with her fingers, and she was not going to change that because she was unsettled. The letter was a single page. The handwriting was his, not the formal hand he used for documents, which she also knew, but the other one, slightly less controlled, the one she had seen on the rare occasions he wrote something without a secretary. Serena, I have your address through Carr's office. I am not going to pretend I didn't look for it. I am not writing to ask you to come back. I understand that asking is not the correct instrument here. I'm writing because I owe you a statement that I should have made in the carriage and didn't, and that I should have made at Alderton's dinner and didn't, and that I have been making to myself in retrospect for 2 weeks with increasing difficulty. You managed this estate well. You managed it better than well. The tenancy dispute was handled correctly. Pemberton was wrong, and I let him be wrong in your direction because it was easier than making it uncomfortable, and that was a failure of mine that I dressed as social judgment. I don't expect this to accomplish anything. I'm aware of what it would have been worth if I'd said it when it would have mattered. I'm saying it anyway. Damian. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the correspondence file she kept for things that required a response and had not yet received one. She went back to the renovation timeline. The response she wrote 4 days later was shorter than his. Damian, I know you believe what you've written. That's not the same as it being sufficient, and I think you know that too. I'm not returning to Ashford. The business is under construction, and I am, for the first time in several years, doing work that bears my name. I would ask that you complete your side of the legal process, because the suspension helps neither of us, and I would like the clarity. I hope you are well. Serena. She sealed it and posted it that afternoon. She did not wait to see what it produced. She had learned something important about waiting, which was that it was only a useful strategy when the thing you were waiting for had a reasonable probability of arriving. She had enough evidence now to assess probabilities accurately, and what she needed to do was build, not wait. The business opened on the 3rd of April. Vale Coordination, as Mr. Carr's filing had it, a commercial import coordination and logistics advisory firm, which was a more precise description of what she was doing than it might sound to someone who hadn't spent 6 years managing the supply networks of a major estate. She had 2 clients before the sign went up, secured in the weeks of renovation through the harbor market connections she had started building on day 3, because she was a woman who networked in every room she entered, including rooms where she was buying fish. The first was a textile merchant named Hollowell, who had been spending 15% over market on his import handling because he was using a firm that overcharged, and he had not had time to verify this. Serena had verified it in a single afternoon with the ledger records he provided, and had presented him with a restructured cost model that saved him the 15% and added a 12% improvement in delivery scheduling. He had looked at her across the table with the expression of someone recalibrating a prior assumption. "Where have you been?" he said. Not rudely, with genuine curiosity. "Managing someone else's estate," she said. "I won't be doing that anymore." The second client was a shipping consortium she had found through Mr. Carr, 3 partners who needed coordination services for a new trade route they were establishing and who had been told by Carr, with understated precision, that the woman setting up on Harbor Lane was the person to talk to. She hired 1 assistant, a young woman named Petra, 22, the harbor master's youngest daughter, who had an aptitude for figures and who had been told repeatedly by the professional world that this aptitude was not an appropriate primary skill for a person of her situation, and who had accordingly developed a fairly comprehensive contempt for the professional world's opinions. They understood each other immediately. The sign above the door read, "Vale Coordination, Commercial Advisory." The letters were painted in dark blue on cream, clean, and unornamental, because she had spent 7 years in a house full of ornamentation, and she was done with things that announced themselves before they had earned it. It was 3 weeks after the opening, on a morning when the harbor was running rough under a cold offshore wind, that she first heard the name Harwick. She heard it from Hollowell, who mentioned it in the context of a shipping contract negotiation the way you mention a weather event, matter-of-factly, with an undertone of something else. "You'll want to be careful with that one," he said. "Why?" "Harwick and his people run a significant portion of the Port Calvern commercial freight. They have relationships with 3 of the 7 harbor commissioners. They don't like new operations setting up in their space without what you might call a prior conversation." She looked at him. "They haven't approached me." "No, they won't, directly. That's not how it works." He paused. "You'll know when they're paying attention. Things will become slightly more difficult without a clear reason. processing delays, documentation requests, the kind of friction that doesn't come from anywhere you can point to. She absorbed this. And if I have the prior conversation myself, then you're negotiating from their terms. She looked at the harbor through the window. A container barge was coming in slow against the wind, the kind of careful, deliberate work that required reading conditions accurately and adjusting to them without stopping. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for approximately 4 hours, and then she drafted a letter to Harwick's commercial office requesting a meeting, on her terms, at a time of her choosing. She had managed a duke. She was not particularly alarmed by a harbor commissioner with commercial interests. Damian's second letter arrived 5 days later. It was longer than the first. She could see, before she opened it, that it was longer, and she felt something she chose not to examine too carefully. Not hope, which she had educated herself out of, but a kind of watchfulness. The alertness of someone who has been very still for a long time and has heard a sound they cannot immediately identify. "Serena, I received your letter. I understand the request. I have not yet completed my side of the process, and I'm going to be honest with you about why, because honesty is apparently the only thing I have left to offer that has any value, and I would prefer to offer something that has value rather than something that is merely correct. I haven't submitted the document because submitting it is the end of the ability to change what I did, and I am not yet certain that I have fully understood what I did. I am aware this sounds like delay dressed as reflection. I cannot entirely refute that. But I have spent the last month having the kind of honest conversation with myself that I apparently should have had significantly earlier, and I am trying to conduct it with more accuracy than I have previously brought to things that concerned you. What I understand so far, I treated you as a component of a functioning system. I was aware on some level that you were more than that. I chose not to examine that awareness because examining it would have required me to change something, and changing things costs more than ignoring them, in the short run. The cost in the long run is apparently more significant. I am not asking you to respond to this if you'd prefer not to. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I spent too long saying nothing. Damian. She read it 3 times. The third time, she put it down on the desk and sat for a long while with her hands flat on the surface and looked at the harbor and thought about the man she had married at 23. Not the man he had been over the last 7 years. The managed, remote, precisely uninvested version she had spent 7 years navigating. The man she had thought she saw at the beginning, under the coldness. The quality in him that she had loved, she realized now, with the kind of clarity that comes when you remove yourself from the field. Not his power, not his face, not the social force of him, but the occasional flashes of a particular intelligence, a capacity for precision and honesty that he had spent his adult life suppressing because, in his world, those qualities had been liabilities. She was seeing that intelligence now, in the letters, turned, finally, in her direction. Too late, she had told him. She still believed that. But she was also, with the honesty she demanded of herself, going to acknowledge that something in these letters moved her in a way that something in her was not prepared for. She did not write back that night. She wrote back 3 days later, 1 paragraph. Damian, I understand the distinction you're making between delay and reflection. I will give you the benefit of it, briefly, but I need you to understand something. I am not waiting. My life here is not a pause in the story until something resolves between us. It is the story. Whatever you are working out, work it out on your own time. My time belongs to me. Serena. She posted it and went to her meeting with Harwick. Matek. Harwick's office was in the Upper Harbor District, in a building that announced its importance through scale rather than taste, large, newer than it needed to be, the kind of place built by someone who had made money recently and wanted the architecture to confirm it. The man himself was 50, heavy-set, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no by someone he couldn't subsequently acquire or remove. He had 3 men in the room with him, which told her this was a performance of power rather than an actual negotiation. She sat across from him with her hands folded and her back straight, and the same expression she had worn at 60-person dinners when she was managing her husband's social position and waiting to see what was coming at her. Mrs. Vale. He said it with a slight emphasis on the prefix, the kind of emphasis that was meant to be noticed. I understand you've set up a coordination operation on Harbor Lane. That's correct. You're new to Port Calvern. I am. Then there are things about how this city operates that you may not be fully aware of. He leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man in his own territory. Port Calvern's commercial freight network functions as well as it does because of long-standing relationships, established understandings. New operations that come into that network without those understandings tend to create friction. I've heard, she said. I've also heard that your firm charges 15% above market on handling and that 3 of your harbor commissioner relationships are currently under scrutiny from the municipal auditor's office. She paused. I read commercial filings, Mr. Harwick. I find them informative. The room was very quiet. One of the 3 men near the window shifted his weight. Harwick looked at her with an expression that had moved from genial territorial posturing into something more focused and considerably less comfortable for him. That information is available, she said. Publicly available. I spent 6 years managing a major estate's commercial supply network. Reading filings is a basic competency. She met his eyes. I'm not here to disrupt your network. I'm here to operate within it, but I operate from accurate information, and I thought you should know that. A long moment. What kind of arrangement are you proposing? He said. I'm not proposing an arrangement. I'm introducing myself. She stood. You'll find that working with Vale coordination will be straightforward, competent, and conducted at market rates. I imagine over time that will make more sense to you than the alternative. She extended her hand. Thank you for your time. He looked at her hand for 1 beat too long, then shook it. She walked out of the building and into the cold harbor air and stood on the steps for a moment with the wind off the water moving through her coat and felt, with a clarity she wanted to remember, the specific sensation of having walked into a room at a disadvantage and walked out even. She had spent 7 years in a house where she was never even. She was learning what it felt like to be in the world on her own terms. The 3rd letter from Damian arrived 6 weeks after she'd left Ashford. She was at her desk at 7 in the morning when Petra set it on the corner without comment, because Petra had seen 2 letters arrive before this one and had the tact of someone young enough to be curious and wise enough not to act on the curiosity. Serena looked at it for a moment before she opened it. Serena, I'm coming to Port Calvern. I am not asking permission. I understand that I am not in a position to ask for anything, which means I am not asking. I am informing you. You can tell me not to come, and I will consider that information. But I need to say something that I cannot say in a letter, and I have spent 3 weeks attempting to say it in a letter and finding that the medium is insufficient. I'll be there Friday. I'll find a hotel. I won't approach the business premises without your agreement, but I need you to give me an hour. I am asking for an hour. Not to reverse what you've done. I have stopped believing I can reverse it, and I'm trying to stop wanting to. But there's something I haven't said that needs to be said in person, and I am telling you this in advance because you deserve the preparation. Damian. She set it down. She stood up from the desk and walked to the window and looked at the harbor and breathed. He was coming here, to her city, to the space she had built out of her own competence and her own capital and her own 2 months of starting over. He was coming here, and the fact that he had announced it instead of simply appearing was, she acknowledged to herself, a different kind of behavior than the behavior she had spent 7 years trying to navigate. It was the behavior of a man who understood, at least partially, that he had given up the right to simply appear in her life and take up space. She stood at the window for a long time. Then she went back to the desk and wrote a single line on a card and posted it with the evening collection. Friday. The Harbor Cafe on Anchor Street. 11 o'clock. 1 hour. She posted it and went back to work. She did not tell herself she was ready. She was not ready. She was a woman who had signed divorce papers and moved to a new city and built a business in 60 days and met a man with commercial influence in his own office and held her ground. And she was not ready for a conversation on a Friday morning with the man she had spent 7 years loving and 1 morning leaving. But she had learned, in the last 2 months, that readiness was a luxury she had never actually been able to afford, and that she had done most of the things that mattered in her life while not quite ready for them. Friday was 4 days away. She had 4 days of work to do. She worked. He arrived Thursday evening. She knew because she saw him. She hadn't expected to. Port Calvern was not a small city, and his hotel was on the east side of the commercial district, and the cafe was on Anchor Street, and her apartment was above the office on Harbor Lane, and there was no logical reason their paths should cross on Thursday evening when he had agreed to 11 o'clock Friday. But she was at the Harbor Market at 6, because she went to the Harbor Market on Thursday evenings for supplies, and had done since the third week, and she was at the fish seller's table near the eastern dock when she saw him. He was walking along the dock road with the particular quality of a man in an unfamiliar city who was not lost but was finding his bearings. Observant, deliberate, taking in the space. He was in a coat she didn't recognize, darker and simpler than what he wore at Ashford, and he looked— she was trying to find the accurate word, the honest one. He looked reduced, not in the sense of diminished, in the sense of stripped of the architecture he wore at home, the estate, the title, the particular force field of Damian Ashford in his own territory. He looked like a man standing in a city that didn't know who he was. She understood, in that moment, what it had cost him to come here. Not materially. He had money. The travel was nothing. But in the other sense, the sense of standing somewhere without the support structure that had defined him, in a place that his wife had built without him, looking at a life she had made that had not required him at all. He hadn't seen her yet. She turned back to the fish seller and completed her purchase and walked home by the route that did not pass the dock road. She did not know what to do with what she had just felt. She filed it alongside the letters and the signed document and the 7 years under a heading she didn't have a name for yet. Friday was 16 hours away. She ate dinner alone in the apartment above the office and listened to the harbor and held the thing she couldn't name and waited, with the practiced patience of a woman who had spent a very long time waiting and who was now, for the first time, waiting for something she had chosen. Chetik. The cafe on Anchor Street was not much. Harbor District practical, wooden tables, a coal stove burning against the morning cold, the smell of strong coffee and salt air through the open door. She arrived at 10 minutes to 11, early as she always was, and took a table at the window where she could see the street and the harbor beyond it. She ordered coffee and sat with her hands folded and watched the boats. He came in at 3 minutes to 11. He looked for her immediately when he entered the room. Not scanning, not uncertain. He looked for her the way someone looks for something they have been looking for a while and have been thinking about how to approach. He found her at the window and crossed to the table and sat down across from her and said nothing for a moment. She looked at him. He looked older than he had 6 weeks ago. She noted this without judgment. She probably looked different, too. "Thank you for agreeing to this," he said. "You said you had something to say." He looked at her. The expression she had spent 7 years trying to name was doing something new, not blank, not remote, something open in a way she hadn't seen from him. The particular openness of a man who has been very defended for a very long time and has recently sustained damage to the defenses. "I need you to know that I'm not here to ask you to come back," he said. "I know that I said that in the letter, but I want to say it to your face so you can see that I mean it." She waited. "I'm here because I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it directly, not on paper." He paused. He was not a man who paused before speaking. He was a man who chose his words before he opened his mouth and delivered them as complete things. The pause told her something. "I didn't know how to be in that house with you. I didn't know how to be in that marriage. I told myself that was a fact about me, a given, that I was a particular kind of man, and the particular kind of man I was did not. He stopped. "I used that as an excuse to not try. And what I'm trying to tell you is that I knew, on some level, not always, not clearly, but I knew that what you were doing, what you were giving, that it was real. And I chose not to match it because matching it would have cost me something, and I decided the cost was too high." The Harbor Cafe made its quiet sounds around them. A woman behind the counter. 2 men at the far table with newspapers. "And now?" she said. "Now I understand the actual cost." He looked at her across the table with something in his face that she had no prior version of. No frame to put it in. "I lost the one person who was actually there, who chose to be there. Every day." His jaw moved. "I watched you sit in that room with Pemberton, and I made a calculation. I made it in half a second without thinking about what I was calculating with. And the thing I was calculating with was you. Your reputation, what you were owed. I used that as a variable. I traded it for ease. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. I know you know. That's not the point. The point is that I'm telling you this because you deserve to have me say it to your face, not because I expect it to change anything. He paused. I'm going to complete the legal process. I understand that you've asked for that, and I've been delaying it, and that the delay has only served me, and that's not acceptable. He reached into his jacket and placed the document on the table between them. His signature was already on it. I had it witnessed yesterday. It's ready to submit. She looked at the document. Her own signature from the morning in the study. His, fresh and clear beside it. She looked back at him. There's one more thing, he said. His voice had changed register, quieter, the particular quiet of something being said that cannot be unsaid. I'm not going back to Ashford after this. I've arranged for the estate to be managed by a professional firm. I have a house in the city, and I'm going to figure out what I am without the structure I've been using as a substitute for one. She sat very still. I'm not telling you this to ask for anything, he said. I'm telling you this because you made the same choice when you left. You walked away from the structure and you built something real on the other side of it, and I need you to know that I can see that. I can see what you've built. I walked past Harbor Lane last night. A faint pause. Vale coordination. Dark blue letters. She absorbed this. I saw you, she said, at the harbor market, Thursday evening. Something moved in his face. I didn't see you. I know. He looked at her for a long time. Outside the window, the harbor was moving under the morning wind, and the boats were making their particular sounds, and the city she had chosen was doing what it did on a Friday morning, going about its business, purposeful, indifferent to her, which was exactly what she needed it to be. She picked up the document. She held it for a moment, and then she looked at him, at the man who had been her husband, and who had treated her with a consistent insufficiency for 7 years, and who was sitting across from her in a harbor cafe in a city he had traveled to without knowing if she would see him, with his defenses reduced to something she had never seen on him before, saying the things that were true even though they accomplished nothing practical for him, saying them because they were true, and she felt the things she had been not naming since the letters arrived fracture open in her chest like a seam giving way under pressure. She did not let it show on her face. I'm going to submit this, she said. It goes to the solicitor today. He nodded. I know. And then it's done. Yes. She stood. She folded the document and put it in her case and looked down at him at the table and said, with the steadiness that had carried her through 7 years and 60 days of rebuilding, You should have said all of this while it could have mattered. I know. She walked to the door. The harbor wind came through when she opened it, cold and direct and salt-sharp. She stepped through, and then, with her hand still on the door and her back to the room, she stopped. Not because she had changed her mind, not because the 7 years had somehow become different, but because the man sitting at that table had just handed her a signed document and said, I'm sorry, in the only way that was actually worth anything, without asking for a return on it, without the apology functioning as currency toward a transaction. He had said it the way you say things you have stopped expecting to get anything for. And she was a woman who believed in accuracy. She turned back. He was looking at her. He had not moved. He was very still in the way he was still when he was actually feeling something he hadn't prepared a response for. She looked at him across the cafe. I'm not coming back to Ashford, she said. I know. I'm not going back to any version of what that was. I know. But she held his gaze. The words sat between them with the weight of everything that came after it. All the months and the cost and the distance and the things she couldn't name that had been fracturing open since the letters. If you stay in the city, if you are different, not perform different, actually different, over time with evidence. She paused. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her. She let the door close behind her and walked back to Harbor Lane. The document was in her case and would be submitted by afternoon, and the legal fact of the end would be entered into the record. And that was right, and that was necessary, and none of it answered the question of what came after the ending, or whether the man sitting in a harbor cafe in her city was the beginning of something she didn't have language for yet, or whether she was making the most expensive mistake of her life. She walked through the harbor district with the cold wind at her back and the sound of the water and the sight of the dark blue letters above her door as she turned onto Harbor Lane. And she did not know, and she was not going to know for some time. And she stopped cold in the doorway. The office door was open. It had been locked when she left. Petra was not due until noon. She stepped inside and found, on her desk, a single document. Not correspondence, not a filing. A commercial injunction notice, stamped with the Port Calvern municipal seal, citing an administrative irregularity in her business registration that she knew with absolute certainty did not exist. Harwick's name was nowhere on it. It didn't need to be. She stood in her office in the city she had chosen and looked at the document and understood, with the cold, clear accuracy she had been using to navigate since she was 30 years old and started over, that she had just walked into the opening move of a war she had not yet declared herself ready for. She picked up the injunction and read it carefully from beginning to end. Then she set it down, sat at her desk, and began drafting her response. The injunction cited Section 14 of the Port Calvern Commercial Registration Act. Serena read it twice and then read it a third time because she was a woman who did not act on a first reading of anything that mattered, and what she found on the third pass was what she had suspected on the first. The citation was technically valid in form and substantively fraudulent in fact. The irregularity alleged was a discrepancy in her principal business address filing, a single-line entry that she had completed correctly and that she could prove she had completed correctly because she had the original document in the cabinet behind her desk with Mr. Carr's countersignature and the municipal stamp dated 6 weeks prior. Someone had altered the municipal record, not forged her document. Altered the copy held at the registrar's office, which meant someone with access to the registrar's office, which meant either a clerk who had been paid or a commissioner who had made a call, and either way it traced back to the same origin point. She pulled the original filing from the cabinet and set it beside the injunction and looked at both of them together. The business was frozen pending resolution. That was the practical consequence. She could not execute new contracts, could not invoice existing clients, could not conduct any commercial transaction under the Vale Coordination name until the irregularity was resolved. Resolution required a formal hearing before the Municipal Commerce Board. The earliest available date for that hearing, according to the notice, was 6 weeks out. 6 weeks. No revenue. 2 clients mid-contract who would need to find alternative arrangements, or wait, and who had no obligation to wait, and who would not wait because they were commercial operators with their own obligations and timelines. She would lose them both. She sat with this for exactly as long as it took her to understand the full shape of it, and then she stood up and went to find Mr. Carr. His office was 12 minutes from Harbor Lane on foot. She walked it in 9. He was with a client. His secretary, a young man named Oates, who had learned in the past 6 weeks that Mrs. Vale's visits did not fit the standard appointment framework, took one look at her face and knocked on the inner office door without being asked. Carr came out 2 minutes later, read her expression, and said come in to her and 5 minutes to his client in the same breath. She put both documents on his desk. He read them in silence. She watched his face, which was the face of a man who had been practicing commercial law in Port Calvern for 40 years, and who was therefore not easily alarmed, process something that was alarming. The original is clean, he said. Yes. The registrar's copy has been amended. Yes. He sat back. This is Harwick. Obviously. He has a relationship with Commissioner Aldrin. Aldrin has access to the registrar's records. He paused. This is not the first time something like this has happened to an operation that came into conflict with Harwick's network. It's the first time I've seen it done this cleanly. Can we challenge it? Yes. At the hearing in 6 weeks. Can we challenge it faster? Possibly. If we can get a magistrate to look at the original filing versus the registrar's copy and issue a preliminary injunction against the injunction, so to speak. He paused. That requires a magistrate who isn't in Harwick's pocket. She looked at him. Are any of them not? A long beat. 1. Magistrate Reeve. She was appointed from the city circuit rather than the port district, and she has no commercial relationships with the harbor operators. He paused. She's also very busy and very difficult to get in front of quickly. Get me in front of her, Serena said, whatever it takes. He looked at her across the desk with the expression of a man who respected competence and was looking at it. I'll try. But Serena, and I say this because I want you to have the full picture. Even if we get the preliminary hearing, even if Reeve issues the order, Harwick will find another instrument. This was an opening move. He has more. She knew this. She had known it when she read the injunction, had felt it with the bone-deep accuracy of someone who had spent 7 years in a house with a man who used power as a management tool. Harwick was not trying to win a single exchange. He was trying to make her too expensive to maintain. Then we deal with the next one when it comes, she said. Right now, I need this one resolved. She was back at the office by noon. Petra arrived at 12 and found her at the desk drafting client communications. Honest ones, explaining the administrative delay without naming Harwick. Because naming Harwick in a letter created a liability she didn't need, and because what she needed from Hollowell and the consortium was patience, not outrage on her behalf. Petra read the injunction without being invited to, and set it down with the controlled expression of a 22-year-old who had grown up in the Harbor District and understood exactly what it meant. Harwick, she said. Yes. My father said he'd come after you. Serena looked up. Your father said that specifically. He said anyone who walked out of Harwick's office without agreeing to terms was on a clock. Petra sat down at her own desk. He also said the last person who challenged him directly in a Commerce Board hearing was a grain merchant named Selby who had a very good case and very good documentation and still lost because 2 of the 5 board members owed Harwick money. How do you know this? My father is the harbor master. Petra met her eyes. He hears things. Serena absorbed this. Can your father be asked to hear things more specifically about the board members, about what they owe and to whom? A pause. He could be asked. He wouldn't put anything in writing. He doesn't need to. I just need to know which board members I'm actually arguing in front of. Petra nodded. She picked up her pen. I'll talk to him tonight. The letter from Damian arrived the next morning. Not a posted letter. A note, hand-delivered, which meant he was still in the city, which she had not confirmed since Friday. The handwriting on the outside was his, the same uncontrolled version she had come to recognize from the recent correspondence. She opened it at the desk while Petra was at the harbor market for supplies. Serena, I heard about the injunction. I don't know how much you want from me on this, and I am trying very hard not to assume that I know what you need. But I have resources and connections that are relevant to your situation, and I am telling you that they are available if you want them. I also want you to know that I understand what it would mean for you to use them, and I am not offering them as leverage or condition. If you want my help, tell me what you need. If you don't, I will stay out of it entirely. Damian. She read it twice. She sat with the thing it produced in her. Not the comfortable anger that would have been easier to manage, not the dismissal she had practiced, but the specific complicated feeling of a person offering help with no strings in a moment when strings would have made the offer simpler to decline. She put the letter in the file. She did not write back that day. Magistrate Reeves' clerk called Carr's office on Wednesday. The magistrate would see them Thursday at 8 in the morning, the only available slot for the next 2 weeks, 20 minutes maximum. 20 minutes. Serena spent Wednesday evening preparing the argument with the concentration she gave to things that had exactly one opportunity to go correctly. The original filing document, the registrar's amended copy, a one-page comparison prepared by Carr's paralegal showing the specific alteration, a single digit in the address reference number, changed from the correct value to an incorrect one. The chain of submission dates proving the original predated the registrar's copy. A brief on the legal standard for preliminary relief under the Commercial Registration Act. She also prepared, because she was thorough, a secondary argument, what she would say if Reeve declined to issue the preliminary order, what her options were, how long she could operate without revenue before the capital position became critical. The answer to the last question was 11 weeks. She had 11 weeks before the margins became genuinely dangerous. That was sufficient time if the hearing went well. It was not sufficient time if Harwick had more instruments and used them before she resolved the first one. She went to bed at midnight and woke at 5 and was at the magistrate's building at 7:45 with Carr beside her, and both documents in a leather case she had bought specifically because it communicated a certain kind of seriousness. Magistrate Reeve was 60, compact, with the expression of someone who had been told many things in this room that were not true and had developed, over decades, a finely calibrated instrument for detecting the difference. She looked at the documents with her hands flat on the desk and asked 3 questions, pointed, specific, no excess language, and then sat for a moment in silence. "The alteration is visible to the naked eye if you know what you're looking at," she said. "The ink density is slightly different on the amended digit." "Yes," Carr said. "You want a preliminary order staying the injunction pending the full hearing." "We want the preliminary order and an accelerated hearing date," Serena said. The 6-week delay was designed to cause commercial damage. Reeve looked at her. "I know what it was designed to do, Mrs. Vale." A pause. "I'm going to issue the preliminary stay. The full hearing will be moved to 3 weeks from today. I'm also going to refer the matter of the registrar's record to the municipal inspector's office." She gathered the documents. "I want to be clear about something. The preliminary stay protects your operation for now. What happens at the full hearing depends on the composition of the board and on whether the inspector's referral produces anything useful before then." "I understand," Serena said. "Do you have representation for the full hearing?" "Mr. Carr will represent me." Reeve looked at Carr. "Make sure she understands the board composition." "She already does," Carr said. They were on the street outside the magistrate's building at 8:22 with the preliminary stay order in the case and the cold harbor wind doing what it did to every exposed surface in Port Calvern. 3 weeks, Carr said. "That's better than I expected." "The board composition," Serena said. "Petra's father confirmed 2 of the 5 members have financial relationships with Harwick's operation, which means I need 3 votes from the remaining 3, and all 3 need to hold." "That's correct." "Who are they?" He named them. She filed the names in the part of her mind where she kept things that required separate and sustained attention. "The inspector's referral," she said. "If it produces evidence of deliberate alteration, if someone at the registrar's office can be shown to have altered the record on instruction, that changes the board's calculus. It might, but that investigation takes time and may not produce anything before the hearing. Then I need something else." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Harwick has been doing this for years. The grain merchant Selby. Whatever came before Selby. There's a pattern, and patterns leave records, and if I can find the records and put them in front of the 3 board members who aren't compromised..." She stopped. Thought. "I need to talk to Selby." Selby was found through Petra's father, who knew everyone in the harbor district, which turned out to be the single most valuable asset in Port Calvern. He was 55, ran a small grain storage operation on the western dock, and received Serena in a warehouse office that smelled of grain dust and salt. He listened to her explain the injunction with the expression of a man listening to a story he already knew the middle of. "He did the same thing to me," Selby said. "Record alteration. Mine was a safety certification, not a registration filing. Different instrument, same result." "You lost the hearing." "I lost the hearing." He paused. "I also lost a year's contracts and nearly lost the business." "The board members who voted against you, Aldrin and Moss, same 2 Harwick always uses. And the other 3. He was quiet for a moment. "Commissioner Harland voted for me. Took the case seriously. The other 2, Vance and Petrie, I always thought they could have gone either way, but they read the room wrong. Thought Harwick had more weight than he did at that particular moment." "What would have changed their votes?" Selby looked at her with the expression of someone who had spent 3 years thinking about exactly that question. "Evidence that the pattern was systemic. Not just my case. Harwick's whole operation, documented. If Vance and Petrie had seen that they weren't adjudicating a single dispute, but a deliberate commercial suppression strategy, I think they would have held." She looked at him. "Do you have your documentation from the hearing?" "Every piece of it." "Can I see it?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with the measured assessment of a man who had been in this position before and understood what it cost to try again. "Why would I help you?" he said. Not hostile, genuine. "Because if I win," she said, The inspector's referral and the hearing record become part of the public commercial file. Harwick's pattern gets documented in a way that protects the next operation he tries this on. She paused. And because I think you've wanted someone to put it in front of the board correctly for 3 years, and I'm the person in front of you right now who's willing to try. He sat with that. Then he stood and went to the filing cabinet. She was at the office until 11 that night going through Selby's documentation with Petra, who had stayed without being asked. The material was substantial. 2 other operations beyond Selby who had faced similar instruments. One, a textile importer who had settled with Harwick quietly rather than face the hearing process. One, a ship repair firm that had simply left Port Calvern. All of them within the last 8 years. All of them following the same pattern. Approach, implicit threat, resistance, administrative instrument, hearing, loss or withdrawal. The pattern was there, clear to anyone willing to look at it together rather than in isolation. This is enough, Petra said. It's enough for Harland. I need it to be enough for Vance and Petrie. What's the difference? Serena looked at the documents spread across the desk. Harland is principled. Principled people respond to evidence. Vance and Petrie are cautious. They respond to risk assessment. I need to show them that the risk of being on the wrong side of this is higher than the risk of crossing Harwick. Petra was quiet for a moment. How do you do that? I make sure they know about the inspector's referral and what it's likely to produce. I make sure they understand that this case is going to be on record regardless of their vote. And I make sure the documentation from Selby and the others is in the public file before the hearing, not just presented at it. Carr can do that filing? Yes. Petra looked at her across the desk. You've done this before. This kind of thing. I managed a large estate for 7 years, Serena said. A great deal of that was understanding which problems required direct solutions and which required making the landscape unfavorable to the opposing party before the direct confrontation happened. You were good at it. I was very good at it, Serena said. Nobody knew because the name on the documents wasn't mine. She went back to the papers. Aunt. She found the letter slipped under the office door the next morning when she arrived at 6:30. Not a note this time. A full page on paper she recognized as hotel stationery. She picked it up off the floor and read it standing in the doorway with the early harbor light coming through the windows. It was not from Damian. It was from Harwick's solicitor. The language was formal and courteous and direct in the way that formal, courteous language could be when it was delivering something designed to function as a final warning. It acknowledged the preliminary stay. It noted the accelerated hearing date. It expressed in the circumspect vocabulary of legal correspondence the expectation that Mrs. Vale would find the full hearing process considerably more costly than the current disruption, and suggested that a private settlement, the terms of which could be discussed at a meeting of her choosing, would serve her interests better than a contested proceeding. In other words, you can still walk away. She stood in the doorway of her office on Harbor Lane with the harbor behind her and the dark blue letters above her head and the letter in her hand, and understood with the complete absence of drama that came with understanding things clearly that this was the moment Harwick had designated as the one where she was supposed to fold. She put the letter in the case with the injunction. She made coffee. She sat down and continued drafting the public record filing that Carr would submit by end of business. At 9 that morning, she wrote back to Damian. Damian, there is one thing you can do. I need to know whether Lord Alderton has any standing relationship with the Port Calvern Municipal Commerce Board, specifically with Commissioners Vance or Petrie. He has broad political connections, and you know him better than I do. I'm not asking you to intervene. I'm asking you to find out whether a connection exists that I can work with. This is not an opening toward anything other than what I've stated. I want to be clear about that. Serena. She posted it and did not wait for the response because waiting was not available to her. She had a filing to complete and a case to build and 3 weeks to do it in. His response arrived the same afternoon, hand-delivered again, which meant he was monitoring for her correspondence with a speed that told her he was not otherwise occupied in this city, which told her something she put in the same file as everything else and did not examine while she had immediate work to do. Alderton knows Petrie personally. They were at school together. He has described Petrie to me as a man who values his reputation above most things, and who has made decisions he regrets when he's felt socially pressured into them. I've already spoken to Alderton. He'll make a call to Petrie, not about the case, about the inspector's referral and what's likely to come out of it. Alderton can be very precise about what information he delivers and how. I did not wait for your permission for this because the situation didn't allow for it. If that was wrong, tell me and I'll address it. Damian? She read it once. He had moved without being asked, moved correctly, and then told her about it immediately and offered to walk it back if she said the word. She sat with this for a moment. The specific texture of it, so different from 7 years of a man who moved without consulting her in 100 small ways and never acknowledged any of them. And then she filed it under things that required more attention than she had available right now and went back to the draft. Bob. The next 12 days were the hardest work she had done since the first weeks at Port Calvern, which had themselves been the hardest work she had done since the 3rd year at Ashford, when the estate had nearly bankrupted, and she had spent 4 months in quiet crisis management that no one except the solicitor had known was happening. Carr filed the public record submission on Friday. It was thorough and documented, and the comparison of the 3 cases, Selby, the textile importer, the ship repair firm, was laid out with the specific clarity of someone who had spent 6 years producing financial documents that had to be legible to parties who were not necessarily inclined to read carefully. Harwick's solicitor filed a counter-objection on Monday. She had expected this. Carr responded by Wednesday. She had expected that too. On Thursday, Petra's father passed word through Petra that Harwick had been in a closed-door meeting with Commissioner Aldrin for 2 hours on Wednesday afternoon. She had expected this as well. What she had not expected was what Petra told her on Friday morning, sitting across the desk with the particular expression of someone who had received information they were not certain how to deliver. "My father heard something last night," Petra said, "at the harbor master's office, from one of the dock supervisors." Serena looked at her. "Tell me." "Harwick isn't just trying to push you out of the market. There's a buyer. For the Harbor Lane property. A commercial developer who wants the whole block for a freight consolidation warehouse. The developer has been negotiating with 3 of the 4 property owners on that block for 6 months. Petra paused. "Your building is the 4th, the one that wasn't for sale." Serena went very still. "The injunction wasn't about market competition," she said. "No, it was about forcing a sale. If the business can't operate, the property becomes a liability. If the legal fight drags on long enough and costs enough, I sell." Serena's voice was flat. "Or I run out of capital and the property goes into default, and it sells anyway." "Yes." She sat for a long moment looking at the harbor through the window. The morning light was flat and gray, and the boats were moving in from the night fishing, and the city was doing what the city did, indifferent and purposeful, and she was sitting in the middle of it, understanding that the fight she had prepared for was not the actual fight. The actual fight was about real estate. She had built her business into the middle of someone else's acquisition strategy without knowing it, and everything Harwick had done since the day she walked out of his office had been aimed not at her operation, but at her building. She had been preparing the wrong argument. Everything she had built, the Selby documentation, the pattern evidence, the Alderton connection through Petrie, was a strong case for commercial competition law. It was not a strong case against a property acquisition strategy that was using commercial competition law as a proxy instrument. The hearing was 11 days away. She looked at Petra. "Who is the developer?" Petra told her. She did not recognize the name. She wrote it on a card and stood up. "I need to go see Mr. Carr." Carr's expression when she laid it out for him was the expression of a man who had been practicing law for 40 years and who was recalibrating his understanding of a case he thought he had understood. "If the injunction was pretext for a forced sale," he said slowly, "then the Commerce Board isn't the right venue. The right venue is the property court, and the right instrument is an unfair acquisition claim under the municipal property protection statutes. Can we file in property court before the hearing?" "We'd need to file immediately. Today." He paused. "If we file in property court and cite the commercial instruments as part of the acquisition strategy, we create a conflict of jurisdiction that either delays the hearing or reframes it entirely." "Delays it how long?" Months, potentially. And during the delay, the preliminary stay remains in effect. Yes, your operation continues. She looked at him. Can we win the property case? If we can prove the acquisition intent, yes. The municipal property protection statutes are strong. They were designed precisely to prevent this kind of pressure acquisition. He paused. But proving acquisition intent requires showing the developer's connection to the commercial instruments, showing that Harwick was acting as the developer's instrument rather than independently. Can we show that? Do you have anything connecting them? She did not. Not yet. What she had was a name and a timeline, and the knowledge that sometimes the shape of a thing told you what it was made of before you could see the material. Give me 48 hours, she said. She walked out of Carr's office and back into the harbor wind and stood on the street for a moment with her mind moving at the speed it moved when she was under real pressure. Not panicking, not freezing, but running every instrument she had in parallel, looking for the entry point. She thought about what she had, what she knew about acquisitions, about how developers operated, about the paper trail that even the most careful commercial transaction left behind if you knew where to look. She thought about Damian, who was in this city, who had connections she did not have, who had offered those connections without conditions. She thought about what it would mean to ask. She pulled out the card with the developer's name and looked at it. And then, for the second time in her life, Serena Vale made a decision that was going to change everything. Not because she was running out of options, but because she had looked at the full picture with clear eyes and identified the fastest route to the accurate answer. She turned and walked toward Damian's hotel. The hotel was called the Meridian, and it sat on the east side of the commercial district 4 blocks from the harbor, the kind of establishment that understood its clientele without needing to announce it. Quiet, well-run, the sort of place that did not ask questions about guests who received hand-delivered correspondence at irregular hours. Serena walked through the front door at 9:10 in the morning with the developer's name on a card in her coat pocket and the particular quality of movement she had when she had made a decision and was executing it before the part of her brain that specialized in second-guessing caught up. The desk clerk looked at her once and reached for the house phone without being asked, which told her that Damian had left instructions. She was shown to a sitting room on the second floor. She had been in it for less than 2 minutes when he came through the connecting door from the bedroom, still in his morning clothes, and stopped when he saw her face. He did not say anything. He read her expression the way she had spent 7 years reading his, with the careful attention of someone who had been paying close attention for longer than the other person knew. And then he crossed to the writing table and pulled out the second chair. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me." So she told him. Straight through, no hedging, the full shape of it. The property acquisition, the developer, the 48 hours, what she needed to prove and what she was missing. He listened without interrupting, which she noted because the Damian she had known at Ashford had interrupted when he thought he understood the point, and he had always thought he understood the point before he actually did. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Caldwell Development," he said, the name she had given him. "You know it." "I know the principal, Marcus Caldwell. He operates out of the city primarily, but he's been expanding into the coastal markets for the last 3 years. He paused. "He and Harwick have a standing relationship. I've seen it referenced in commercial filings. Harwick's freight operation handles logistics for 2 of Caldwell's completed warehouses." She looked at him. "That's the connection." "It's a connection. Whether it's provable as a coordinated acquisition strategy is a different question." He stood and went to the writing table where she could see he had been working. Paper spread, a pen, the particular organized density of someone conducting their own research. He moved through the papers with the directness of a man who knew where things were. There are commercial registry filings that would show the timeline of Caldwell's interest in that block. If his acquisition negotiations with the other 3 property owners predated Harwick's approach to you, then the sequence proves intent, she said. He was already assembling the block before I arrived. When I didn't sell, he needed a different instrument. Yes. He found what he was looking for and handed it across to her. A registry printout, commercial property transactions, the Harbor Lane block. 3 sales dated over the preceding 8 months. She looked at the dates and felt something settle into place with the specific satisfaction of a correct answer arriving. "I need the 4th one," she said. "The original offer to me. Whether he made one before the injunction." Did anyone approach you about the property before the injunction? She thought. The building agent, 3 weeks after I took possession, told me there was a buyer interested in the block and asked if I was open to an offer. Did you get a name? No, I said I wasn't selling and ended the conversation. She looked at the registry printout. But the agent is on record. If I can find the agent and get the documented inquiry, that's the sequence. He met her eyes. Approach, refusal, instrument, documented. Carr can file in property court today if I get him this material. She stood. I need the agent's name, the building agent who handled the Harbor Lane sale. That's in the original purchase registration, he said. Carr has it. She was already moving toward the door. Serena. She stopped, turned. He was standing at the writing table with the papers in his hand and the morning light coming through the window behind him, and he looked like what he was. A man who had been in this city for 2 weeks working on her problem in the hours when she hadn't asked him to, using the resources available to him without fanfare, and who was now looking at her with the expression she had spent 7 years not being able to name, and that she now understood was simply the expression of someone who was completely present. This is going to work, he said. Not reassurance. Assessment. She looked at him for one moment that was not about the case, and then she nodded and walked out. The building agent's name was in the purchase registration exactly where Damian said it would be. Carr had it pulled in 20 minutes. The agent, a man named Torrance who operated a commercial property brokerage on the north side of the Harbor District, received Serena and Carr at 11 that morning with the nervous energy of a man who understood, without being told, that the visit was not good news for someone in this transaction. The offer in April, Serena said, before he had fully settled into his chair. The buyer interested in the Harbor Lane block. Torrance looked between her and Carr. I'm not sure what... The inquiry was documented, Carr said. Commercial agents are required to log property inquiries under the Port Calvern brokerage regulations. The log is subpoenable. A pause. The buyer was represented through a holding entity, Torrance said carefully. I didn't have a direct name. The holding entity, Serena said. He told them. It took Carr approximately 4 seconds to recognize the entity as a registered subsidiary of Caldwell Development, because Carr had been practicing commercial law in Port Calvern for 40 years and knew the corporate structures the way he knew the harbor roads. I need a copy of the inquiry log entry, Serena said. Mrs. Vale, I have to think about Mr. Torrance. She met his eyes directly. The municipal inspector's office has a referral about the registrar's record alteration. That investigation is going to look at the full transaction history of this block. Your log entries are going to be part of that investigation regardless. The question is whether you produce them cooperatively now or under subpoena later. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man doing a rapid and unfavorable risk calculation. He got up and went to his filing cabinet. Carr filed in property court at 2:15 that afternoon. The filing was 40 pages, and it documented, with the precision that Carr had spent 40 years developing, the following sequence. Caldwell Development's acquisition of 3 Harbor Lane properties over 8 months. The holding entity's approach to Serena through Torrance in April. Her refusal. Harwick's Commerce Board filing 6 weeks later. The registrar's record alteration. And the connection between Harwick's freight operation and Caldwell's completed warehouses. The Selby material was attached as supporting evidence of a pattern. The inspector's referral was cited. The property court filing created a jurisdictional conflict with the Commerce Board hearing. Carr requested, and the property court judge granted, a stay of the Commerce Board proceeding pending resolution of the property court matter. Harwick's solicitor received the notice at 3 o'clock. By 4, Serena had received a second letter. Not from the solicitor this time. From Harwick directly. It was shorter than the previous correspondence. It said, in the direct language of a man who had abandoned the pretense of legal formality, "You've made this considerably more expensive than it needed to be. A meeting, tomorrow, 10 o'clock. My office." She read it once. She wrote back on a card in 30 seconds. My office. Tomorrow. 10 o'clock. She sent it with Petra and went back to work. Damian appeared at Harbor Lane at 6 that evening. He knocked. He had not come to the office before. He had stayed on his side of the line she had drawn, which she had noted, which she was still noting. She let him in, and he stood in the front office looking at the space with the particular attention of someone seeing a thing clearly for the first time, taking in the dark blue letters visible through the window from the street, the organized desk, the filing system, Petra's station, the harbor visible through the rear window. He responded, she said. He wants a meeting. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. My office. He looked at her. He's coming here. I didn't go to his office the first time expecting an equal conversation, and the result was what it was. He comes here, or there's no meeting. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. What do you want from the meeting? Withdrawal. Full withdrawal. The injunction, the Commerce Board filing, any outstanding instruments. In writing, before he leaves this building. That's a significant concession for him. He's looking at a property court case that will document his acquisition strategy in the public record, an inspector's investigation into the registrar's office, and the Selby pattern evidence that's already been filed. His legal costs are going to exceed the value of adding one building to the block. She looked at him. He'll calculate that. He's a commercial operator. Commercial operators respond to cost. Damian was quiet for a moment. He might come in with a counter. An offer for the property at a number designed to make fighting harder to justify than selling. Then I'll decline it. He'll make it a very good number. I know. She held his gaze. The building isn't for sale. He looked at her for a long moment. I want to be here tomorrow. The room was quiet around them. Through the window, the harbor was moving into its evening configuration. Lights coming on, the deep horns of the larger vessels, the particular quality of a working port settling into its night register. She thought about what it meant to have him here, not just tomorrow. Here, in the last 3 weeks, in the city. The letters, the Alderton connection, the registry research, the conversation this morning, the way he had moved in parallel with her without crowding her, which was so unlike the architecture of their marriage that she was still adjusting to it, still recalibrating the person he was presenting against the one she had spent 7 years knowing. You can be here, she said, but you don't speak in the meeting unless I ask you to. Understood. I mean that, Damian. This is my operation and my terms. I know whose operation it is, he said quietly. That's not why I'm asking to be here. She looked at him. Why are you asking? She said. He met her eyes. Because I watched you build this in 8 weeks, and I want to watch you finish it. The silence between them had a different quality than any silence they had shared in 7 years of marriage. She filed it alongside everything else and kept her face steady. 6 o'clock tomorrow, she said. Don't be late. Harwick arrived at 10:10, which she read correctly as a small dominance gesture. Not egregiously late, just enough to communicate that he was not the one adjusting his schedule. He came with his solicitor and one of the men who had been in the room at their first meeting, the one who had shifted his weight when she mentioned the commissioner's audit. He looked at Damian, sitting in the chair against the wall, and his expression processed something quickly and then smoothed. West Haven, he said. Harwick. Damian's voice was entirely neutral. He did not stand. He had the particular talent, Serena noticed, of being very still in a way that commanded space without appearing to try for it. Harwick looked back at Serena. He sat down across from her at the desk and put his hands flat on the surface and looked at her with the expression of a man who had done this calculation and was here to close it on terms he found acceptable. You've made a strong filing, he said. My people tell me it's solid work. It's accurate work, she said. There's a distinction. The property court case runs long, months, possibly longer. That's disruptive for both of us. More disruptive for you, given what the public record will contain at the end of it. His jaw moved slightly. There's a number that makes this uncomplicated. I told your solicitor the property isn't for sale. The number I have in mind is significantly above market. Mr. Harwick, she kept her voice level, unhurried. The property isn't for sale at any number. What's for sale is a resolution to this situation that doesn't require further litigation. She paused. You withdraw the injunction and the Commerce Board filing in writing before you leave this office. The inspector's referral continues. I don't control that, but the active instruments against my operation end today. He looked at her. The calculation was visible in his face, running. She let it run. She had learned, at Ashford, and at his first meeting and in the last 8 weeks, that the most powerful thing available in a negotiation was the ability to be quiet while the other person worked out whether you were serious. And in return, he said, I don't pursue the property court case. I don't add to the Selby evidence in the public record. Your acquisition of the other 3 properties is your business, and I have no interest in it. She paused. You want the block. You can't have the whole block. You can have 3/4 of it and a clean public record and an operation in Port Calvern that runs without a contested litigation on its books. He was quiet for a long moment. The inspector's referral, he said. That continues regardless. Yes, I told you, I don't control that. What I control is what I file and what I pursue. His solicitor leaned in and said something quietly. Harwick listened with his eyes on Serena. I want the property court case dropped, he said. Filed withdrawal, not just stayed. I'll withdraw the filing if the instruments are withdrawn and the written documentation is executed before close of business today. Another silence. Longer this time. The harbor sounds came through the rear window, and the coal stove was burning low in the corner, and Damian was motionless in the chair against the wall with the quality of stillness he had that she had once mistaken for indifference and now understood was the opposite, the stillness of someone paying complete attention. All right, Harwick said. He said it the way a man said a thing he had known he would say since before he came into the room, but that he had needed to arrive at through the formal process of resistance. She had known men like this at Ashford, men for whom capitulation had to be dressed as pragmatism before it was acceptable. Your solicitor can draft the withdrawal documents here, she said. Mr. Carr is available by telephone to review them. We execute before noon and both parties file by close of business. Harwick looked at her for one final moment. An assessment, the last one, the kind where a man was deciding what category to put you in, and then he nodded and looked at his solicitor, and the solicitor pulled out a legal pad and began to draft. But Harwick was out of the building by 11:40. The withdrawal documents were on the desk. Carr had reviewed them by telephone and confirmed they were complete and enforceable. The property court withdrawal would be filed that afternoon. By end of business today, Vale Coordination would be operating under clear registration with no active instruments against it. Petra looked at the documents and then at Serena with an expression that was fighting to stay professional and losing. Go ahead, Serena said. Petra allowed herself one moment of undisguised satisfaction and then picked up the telephone to call Hollowell with the news. Serena stood at the window and looked at the harbor and felt the particular quality of something genuinely finished. Not the exhausted aftermath of a thing that had gone too long, but the clean completion of something that had been executed correctly. It felt different from Ashford. At Ashford, resolution had always come with an asterisk. Managed, provisional, the kind of completion that left the next problem already forming. This was a different thing. This had her name on it, solely, and it was done. She heard Damian move behind her. She did not turn around. The Alderton called to Petrie, she said. Did it make a difference, in the end? Alderton told me Petrie had already been rethinking his position after Carr filed the pattern evidence. The call confirmed it. He paused. You'd already won the hearing before the property court filing made it irrelevant. She absorbed this. I didn't know that. No, but it's true. She turned then. He was standing near the desk with the documents in front of him and the morning light making the room look cleaner than it was, and he was watching her with the open quality she was still adjusting to, the undefended version of his face that the letters had started and that the last 3 weeks had continued, as though the architecture he had maintained for 34 years was dismantling itself in increments, and he had decided to let it. Thank you, she said, for the registry research, for Alderton, for being here. You would have found all of it without me. Probably it would have taken longer. Then I'm glad I was useful. He said it simply, without irony or subtext, and it landed with the specific weight of a thing said by someone who understood that useful was all he had a right to be right now, and who had made peace with that. She looked at him across the clean, bright room. I'm taking Petra to lunch, she said, the harbor market. There's a place that does extraordinary fish pie, and she's been working since 6 this morning, and she deserves a meal that isn't eaten at her desk. He nodded. Of course. She picked up her coat. She walked to the door. She had it open and the harbor wind was coming through when she stopped, because she had a pattern now of stopping at doors and turned back. "Do you know Port Calvern at all?" she said. "Beyond the hotel and this street." He looked at her. "No." "Then come to lunch," she said. "Petra can tell you about the harbor. She knows everything about this city." She said it to the room, not quite to him, in the tone she used when she was offering something she had decided to offer and was not going to explain further. She walked out into the harbor wind and heard, after a moment, his footsteps on the floor behind her. Bumped. They ate fish pie at a harbor market table with the boats 30 feet away, and Petra talked about Port Calvern with the authority of someone who had grown up inside it, the tidal patterns and the trade routes and the politics of the harbor master's office and the history of the commercial district going back 200 years. And Damian listened with a quality of attention that Serena watched without appearing to watch. He asked questions. Real questions. Not the polite social questions of a man performing interest, but the specific questions of someone who was genuinely trying to understand how a place worked. Petra answered them with increasing ease, her initial wariness dissolving under the pressure of a subject she loved and a listener who was actually listening. Serena ate and said little and let the afternoon do what it was doing. After, she walked back to Harbor Lane alone. Damian had offered to accompany her, and she had said she needed the walk, which was true, and he had accepted it, which she noted. She walked back along the harbor road with the water to her right and the city doing its midday business around her, and she thought about the last 11 weeks. The morning in the study, the train, Mr. Carr's office, the building with its dark blue letters, Harwick, the injunction, the property court filing, the morning in the harbor cafe, the letters. The signed document that had gone into the legal system and that was proceeding toward its conclusion, the end of her marriage, the beginning of this. She was not the woman who had signed those papers in the gray pre-dawn light of Ashford Hall. That woman had been ending something. This woman was in the middle of something, and the middle of something was a different condition entirely, harder in some ways, because it required making decisions without knowing the end, and easier in others, because it required only the next step and not the whole road at once. The next step was the office. The contract she had to reinstate with Hollowell and the consortium, the filing confirmations, the business that was, as of this morning, fully operational and entirely hers. She turned onto Harbor Lane and looked up at the dark blue letters and felt, as she always did when she saw them, the particular satisfaction of a thing that said what it meant. She unlocked the door and went back to work. 3 weeks later, Damian knocked on the office door at closing time on a Thursday. Petra had left an hour before. The harbor was running gold in the late afternoon light. Serena had been going through the quarterly forecast for the consortium, the first quarterly forecast she had produced under her own name, and she was still at the desk when she heard the knock. She opened the door. He was holding a folder of papers. His expression was careful and direct in equal measure, which she had come to understand was what he looked like when he was about to say something that cost him something. "I have a proposal," he said, "a business one. I want to be clear about that before you hear it, because I don't want you to think it's something else." She stepped back from the door. He came in. She sat at the desk, and he sat in the client chair across from it. Not Harwick's chair, she noticed, the other one, and he opened the folder. "Caldwell still wants the block," he said. "He can't have it because you're here. But there's a freight consolidation market in Port Calvern that isn't being adequately served, and that your operation is positioned to address. What he's been trying to build through acquisition could be built differently as a coordination service rather than a warehouse model, if the right operation was structured for it." He looked at her. "I'm not proposing to give Caldwell anything. I'm proposing that you're the person who solves the problem he was trying to solve badly, and that you build it correctly before he finds another instrument." She looked at the folder. He turned it toward her. Inside were 6 pages. A market analysis, a service structure outline, a financial projection. She could see from the first page that the work was serious. Not a sketch. Real analysis, done with the same precision he had brought to the registry research. "When did you do this?" she said. "The last 2 weeks." She looked at him. He met her eyes without deflection. "I'm not asking to be part of the operation," he said. I'm not asking for anything. This is information. If it's useful, use it. If it isn't, put it in the fire. She pulled the folder toward her and read the first page, then the second. She read with the focused attention she gave to things that deserved it, and what she found deserved it. The analysis was accurate, the projections were conservative in the way she respected, the service structure was clean. "This is good," she said. "I had time," he said, simply, "and I know this kind of problem." She looked at him across the desk in the office above the harbor, with the late light coming through the windows, and the dark blue letters visible in the glass reflection, and the city that she had chosen making its sounds around them. And she said something she had not said to him in 7 years of marriage, because it had not been true in 7 years of marriage. "Stay," she said. "I want to think through the second section with someone, and you're here." He stayed. They worked for 2 hours. The folder spread between them, and it was the most functional conversation they had ever had, and neither of them said anything about that, because they were both smart enough to know that saying it would make it fragile, and neither of them was interested in fragile anymore. At 9 o'clock, she closed the folder and looked at him. "I'm going to think about this for a week," she said, "and then I'm going to tell you what I think." "All right. And then, after that," she paused. She was choosing the next words with the care she gave to things that could not be unsaid. "I think we need to talk. Not about business. The other conversation." Something moved in his face that was the open quality, the undefended one, more than she had seen it yet. "I know. Not tonight. I know that too." She nodded. She stood and he stood, and she walked him to the door and opened it, and the harbor night came in, cold and salt, and the sound of the water, the city she had built herself into over 11 weeks, the life that was entirely and correctly hers. He stepped through the door and turned back. "Serena." His voice was quiet. The quality in it was the quality of the letters, the harbor cafe, the 3 weeks of being present without demanding presence back. "Whatever you decide about the proposal, about the other conversation, whatever you decide is right. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him in the doorway with the harbor behind him and the night pressing in, and felt the unnamed thing fracture open again the way it had been fracturing in increments since the cafe, since the morning with the registry documents, since lunch with Petra, and the fish pie and the way he had listened. "I know," she said. She closed the door. She stood in the quiet office and listened to his footsteps recede along Harbor Lane, and then she sat back down at the desk and opened the folder to page 3. And outside the window, Port Calvern went about its night, indifferent and purposeful, full of the noise of a city that had not stopped because her life was rearranging itself inside it. The quarterly forecast was still open on the desk. She picked up her pen. She worked until midnight, and the work was good, and the life was hers. And somewhere 4 blocks away, a man was in a hotel room learning, in the incremental, unglamorous way that real change happened, what it cost to become a person worth choosing. She was not yet choosing. But the folder was on the desk, and the door was not locked, and the dark blue letters above her window said her name into the Port Calvern night. And she was, for the first time in 11 weeks, not frightened of what came next. That was enough for tonight. Tomorrow she would decide what it was enough for. The week she had given herself passed the way significant weeks tended to pass, faster than the weeks before them, slower than they felt in retrospect. She worked through the business proposal with the same methodology she brought to everything that mattered. Read it multiple times, sit with the numbers until they stopped feeling like arguments and started feeling like facts. Identify the assumptions, test the assumptions against what she actually knew about the market. By the end of the 3rd day, she had annotated every page of the 6 and filled 2 sheets of her own with questions and counter-projections. And the conclusion she had arrived at was the same one she had arrived at on the first reading, but that she had needed to earn through process rather than instinct. The proposal was sound. Better than sound. It was the kind of thinking that happened when someone with genuine commercial intelligence applied it to a problem they had been observing carefully for several weeks. She had run operations for 6 years under someone else's name, and she knew what good analysis looked like, and this was good analysis. She also knew what it had cost him to produce it. Not the hours. He had time. He had made himself available. Those were not the cost. The cost was in what it required him to admit about himself, that the skills he had applied to political maneuvering and estate management and the careful administration of his own distance could be turned towards something that served another person. That he was capable of useful, when useful, was the only thing on offer. On the 5th day, she wrote him a letter. 1 paragraph. The proposal is strong. I have questions. Come to the office Friday at 10 and bring something to write on. He was there at 9:55. They worked for 3 hours on Friday morning, and the work was the best kind. Two people who thought differently enough to catch each other's blind spots, and similarly enough to move quickly when they agreed. She asked her questions, and he answered them directly, without defensiveness. And when she pushed back on 2 of the projections, he looked at her numbers and said she was right about one of them, and explained why he disagreed on the other. And the explanation held up under pressure, and she told him so. Petra brought coffee at 11 and left it without comment, with the expression of a young woman who was observing a situation with considerable interest and had decided that professional discretion was the correct response to it. At noon, Serena closed the folder. I'm going to build it, she said. The service structure. Adapted. I want to change the client acquisition sequence and the pricing model in the first phase. The pricing model in the first phase is conservative, he said. It's too conservative. It signals uncertainty about the product. I'd rather come in at market and demonstrate the value than undercut and spend 18 months correcting the positioning. He thought about it. You're right. She looked at him across the desk. I'm going to need capital for the first phase. Not a great deal, but more than I have available after the Harwick costs. He met her eyes. He understood what she was and wasn't saying. I'm not asking you for it, she said clearly. I'm telling you I'll be raising it, and that if you want a position in the operation as an investor, a documented, contracted, commercial position with the terms in writing and my solicitor's signature and no other implications, I'm offering you first right of refusal on that position. He was quiet for a moment. Because the work merited it. Because the work merited it, she confirmed, and because I'm a person who pays what she owes. He looked at her for a long time with the open expression, the undefended one. Something in it was working to stay controlled and not entirely succeeding. I'll take the position, he said. I'll have Carr draft the terms. She stood and held out her hand across the desk. He stood and took it, and they shook hands the way 2 commercial parties confirmed an agreement, and the handshake lasted 1 beat longer than a purely commercial handshake, and neither of them remarked on it. There's the other conversation, she said. She had not let go of his hand. Her voice was level. I said we needed to have it. I meant it. I know. Not here. She released his hand. Sunday. There's a point on the western cliffs where you can see the whole harbor. I go there on Sunday mornings, 7 o'clock. I'll be there, he said. Sunday arrived in the way that Port Calvern Sundays arrived in autumn. Gray-white sky, the sea running dark under a light offshore wind, the harbor below reduced to its essential shapes, the working bones of a city that did not pause for weather or sentiment. She was at the cliff point at 10 to 7. She had been there enough times to know the specific flat stone that caught the eastern light when it came through, and she stood on it with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the water and let herself have the last few minutes of before the conversation, before whatever the conversation produced, before the next thing that the last 5 months had been building toward. She thought about the woman who had sat at the study desk at Ashford Hall before dawn with a pen in her hand. She was not that woman anymore. Not in the dramatic sense of transformation that fictions favored, where the person who emerged from difficulty was comprehensively remade and the old self cleanly shed. She was still herself, the same competence, the same directness, the same capacity for patience that had survived 7 years of misdirection and was still intact, only now pointed at things worth being patient for. What was different was the weight she was no longer carrying. She had not understood until she put it down how much of her own energy had been spent managing the grief of a marriage that never became what she had needed it to be. How much of her capacity had been consumed by the sustained low-grade work of hoping and adjusting and continuing to show up for a person who had not shown up back. She had thought of that expenditure as love, She understood now that it had been love, fully, but that love was not the same thing as a sustainable arrangement, and that the grief of accepting the difference was real and did not require apology and was also now behind her. She heard his footsteps on the cliff path at 7:02. Okay. He came and stood beside her on the flat stone, not close, with the appropriate distance of a man who was not taking proximity for granted. They both looked at the harbor for a moment without speaking. The sea did what it did, moved, gray and specific, indifferent to the two people watching it from the western cliffs. "The divorce was finalized Thursday," she said. "I know, my solicitor notified me." "So did mine." A pause. "How do you feel?" he said, not with the careful social register of a man asking a question he expected to be deflected, with the directness she had come to associate with the version of him that had been presenting itself since the letters. She thought about the honest answer. "Like something closed correctly," she said. "Not easily, correctly." He nodded. He was looking at the water with the expression she had finally named sometime in the last month, through accumulated evidence rather than a single moment of revelation. It was the expression of a man who was thinking about something real. That was all it had ever been. The blankness she had read as indifference had been the face he made when he was actually inside a thought, absorbed, present, just entirely untrained in showing it to anyone. She had spent 7 years misreading the expression. She was not going to make that the foundation of anything. "I need to say something to you directly," she said. "And I need you to let me finish it before you respond." "All right. What you did to me at Ashford was not a single incident or a pattern of small failures. It was 7 years of consistent, deliberate choice to prioritize your own comfort over my presence in your life. I'm not saying this to wound you. I'm saying it because if anything comes next between us, it has to be built on both of us seeing that clearly, not on one of us being careful around it to keep the peace." She paused. "I'm done being careful around uncomfortable truths to keep peace that isn't actually peace." He was quiet. He had let her finish, as he'd said he would. Then he turned from the water and looked at her directly. "I know," he said. "All of it. I've been looking at it without flinching for 5 months because I finally understood that flinching was how I got here, and I'm not interested in getting back here by the same road." His jaw was set, but not with the controlled remoteness of the old architecture, with the effort of someone saying something true that cost them. "I chose ease over you. Every single time there was a choice, I chose what was easier for me. I told myself it was practicality. It was cowardice." The word landed on the cliff air between them. He had said it himself, without prompting, without her having to find a diplomatic route to it. "I spent my whole adult life," he said, "being very good at running things. Estates, political positions, rooms. I was good at managing everything that could be managed from a distance, and I made distance into a management tool, and I used it on you because you were the thing in my life I couldn't manage, and the answer I chose was to keep you far enough away that I didn't have to try." He paused. "You deserve someone who tried. You deserve someone who walked into the difficulty instead of out of it." She looked at him on the cliff with the harbor below and the gray sky above, and the wind moving through both of them, and she felt the unnamed thing complete its fracture. Not dramatically, not with the crescendo she would have written for it in another version of her life, but quietly and completely, the way a thing that has been under pressure for a very long time finally releases when the pressure is correctly identified and addressed. "You're different," she said. "I don't know how much. I'm in the middle of it. You'd have a better view of it than I do." "You are," she said. "I've been watching. Not for evidence to use, just watching the way I watch everything. You're different." He held her gaze. "Is it enough?" She was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, sitting with it honestly, giving it the weight it deserved, because this was the question that everything had been moving toward, and it deserved a true answer rather than a managed one. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the honest answer. I don't know because I've only known this version of you for 5 months, and 5 months is not 7 years. I know you've changed. I don't know yet if the change holds under the ordinary pressure of time, when there's no crisis to be useful in, when it's just the daily work of being present for someone without an urgent reason to be." "That's fair," he said. What I know is this. She turned to face him fully. I'm not the woman who married you at Ashford. I'm not going to manage your environment and absorb your distance and call it love. If anything happens between us, it happens between two people who are honest with each other in the ordinary moments, not just the significant ones. It happens on equal ground. She paused. I have my business. I have my life here. I am not going back to being an appendage of someone else's architecture. I'm not asking you to, he said. I don't want that. I don't want the version of you that existed to make my life run smoothly. I want... He stopped. He was not a man who stumbled over words as a rule, and the stumble was more revealing than a fluent sentence would have been. I want what you are now, the whole of it, the office and the dark blue letters, and the way you walked into Harwick's meeting and the way you walked out of mine. Something moved through his expression that was not performed or calculated. I want to be the person in your life who is worth what you're capable of giving. I understand I have to earn that. I understand it takes time. I'm not asking for a declaration. I'm asking for the chance to show you, in the ordinary moments, that I understand what I threw away and what it actually cost to deserve it back. The harbor below them was doing its morning work. A cargo vessel moving in on the tide, slow and purposeful, the kind of patient-heavy work that required reading conditions accurately and adjusting without drama. She watched it for a moment. Then she said, There's a dinner at the Merchants' Exchange next month, the harbor operators and the commercial coordination firms. I'm attending as Vale Coordination's principal. She paused. I'd like you to come. Not as the Duke of Westhaven, not as my husband or my former husband or any title that defines you in relation to me. As Damian Ashford, who has a commercial interest in a Port Calvern operation and who is possibly a person I'm getting to know. He looked at her. The expression was the open one, fully, without any architecture over it at all. I'll be there, he said. I know you will, she said. And for the first time in 5 months, standing on a cliff above a harbor in a city she had built herself into through the sheer force of her own competence and refusal, she let herself smile at him. Not the managed smile she had produced for 7 years of functions and dinners and all the performances of a marriage that had never quite been won, but the real one, small and unhurried and entirely on her own terms. He looked at it the way a man looked at something he had not known how much he needed until it was in front of him. They walked back down the cliff path into the city as the Sunday morning opened around them, not touching, not talking, the harbor sounds rising up to meet them, the world going about its particular and different business, and between them the careful and unrushed beginning of something that neither of them would risk treating cheaply again. The Merchants' Exchange dinner was on the 14th of November, 6 weeks later. Serena arrived in a gown of deep blue, not the managed presentation of the Ashford years, the careful selection designed to reflect well on a husband who didn't look at her, but the color she had wanted for the last 5 months and had bought 3 days ago for no reason except that it was right. She arrived as Vale Coordination's principal, which was how she was listed in the program, and Hollowell met her at the door with the expression of a man who had spent 4 months watching a professional he respected build something from the ground up and was gratified to have backed it early. You look like someone who won something, he said. I work in a field I'm good at, she said. That's what that looks like. Damian arrived 20 minutes after she did. He found her in the second room, in conversation with the consortium partners, and he came to stand beside her without inserting himself into the conversation, present, but not performing presence. And when she introduced him, she said, Damian Ashford, who has an investment interest in Vale Coordination, and nothing else. And he shook hands and responded to questions about the operation with accurate information and deferred to her on everything that was hers to answer, which was most of it. She was aware of him beside her the way she was aware of things that had earned her awareness, not with the anxious monitoring of the Ashford years, not with the careful distance of the last 5 months, but with the straightforward attention of a woman who had decided that this person was worth watching and who had not yet been proved wrong. The consortium partner, Devereaux, said something to Damian about the freight coordination model, and Damian said something back that was precise and informed, and she saw Devereaux's assessment shift in real time, the way Torrance's had shifted and the way Grist's had shifted, the slight recalibration of a first impression meeting a second reality. She did not say anything about it. At dinner, she was seated with the harbor commissioners on one side and Hollowell on the other, and the work of the evening was the work of a person establishing herself in a professional context she had built from nothing, and she did it with the focused ease of someone who had discovered in the last 5 months that she was considerably better at existing on her own terms than she had been at existing on someone else's. Damian was 3 seats away. They were not together in the sense that would have been visible to anyone watching for it. They were 2 people who were in the same room on the same terms, and between them across the dinner table was occasionally a look, brief, specific, the kind that communicated more than its duration suggested. And she let herself have the looks without editing them. After dinner, she stood on the exchange steps in the cold November air while the carriages were called, and he came to stand beside her. "How did it go?" he said. "Well, the commissioners were easier than I expected. Vance told me without saying it directly that he'd been embarrassed by the Harwick situation and wanted the record noted." "That's useful." "Yes." She looked at the harbor lights. "You handled Devereaux well." "I told him the truth about the operation." He paused. "That's not difficult when the truth is good." She looked at him sideways, the brief specific look. He was watching the same harbor lights she was watching, and his face in the cold air had the quality she had come to rely on. Present, unperformed, the architecture down. "Come to the office tomorrow afternoon," she said. "I want to go through the second phase projections. I've been revising them and I want another set of eyes." "What time?" 3. "I'll be there," he said. She nodded. The carriage was announced. She walked down the steps into the Port Calvern night, and behind her she heard his footsteps pause on the stone, and she knew without looking that he was watching her go. Not the way he had watched her in 7 years of marriage, the incurious peripheral attention of a man for whom she was a component of the background, but the way a person watched something they understood they could not take for granted. She did not look back. She did not need to. The second phase opened in January. The service structure she had built from Damian's proposal and her own revisions had found its market faster than the conservative projection and slower than the optimistic one, which was exactly where a well-calibrated operation landed when the work was real. Hollowell brought 2 additional clients through the expanded model. The consortium extended its contract for a 2nd year. Petra hired an assistant of her own and stopped eating lunch at her desk. The building on Harbor Lane had been repainted in December. Same dark blue letters, same cream ground, just fresh, because the winter damp had done what Port Calvern winter damp did, and she was not the kind of person who let a thing she owned look diminished when the maintenance was within reach. The divorce was a fact in the public record. The legal dissolution of the marriage was complete and correct and permanent. She was Serena Vale, principal of Vale Coordination, resident of Port Calvern, a woman of 31 who had rebuilt her life in 8 months on the western coast, and who would not, if asked, describe any of it as easy or as something she wished had gone differently, because easy was not the same as good, and regret was the one instrument she had declined to pick up in the whole course of it. She and Damian were not married. They were not, in any legal or formal sense, together. What they were was 2 people who had dinner on Thursday evenings and worked on Friday mornings and walked the cliff path on Sundays when the weather permitted, and who were being, with great care and without rushing it, honest with each other in the ordinary moments. It was not what she had thought love looked like at 23. It was considerably more specific than that, and more demanding and more real. On a Thursday evening in late January, she was at the harbor market close to 6 when she saw him. Not accidentally this time. She had told him she would be there, and he had come, because that was the kind of thing that had changed, the ordinary specific showing up that she had asked for and that he was doing with the consistency that changed a pattern into a thing you could rely on. He was at the fish seller's table she had directed him to, talking to the man with the ease of someone who had been coming here long enough not to be a stranger. She stood for a moment and watched him, just watched, without announcing herself, the way she had stood at the harbor market months ago and watched a man she had been married to for 7 years looking reduced and lost in a city that didn't know his name. He was not lost now. He was exactly where he had said he would be, doing what he had said he would do, present without requiring her to manage his presence. She walked over and stood beside him. He looked at her when she arrived with the expression she had finally, fully named. It was not blankness. It had never been blankness. It was the face of a man who was completely inside the moment he was in, who was not managing the room or the person or the conversation, who was simply there, actually there, in the way she had needed him to be for 7 years and had stopped asking for, and had somehow, through the long, unpredictable road of losing everything and building it back differently, found anyway. "Fish pie Friday," he said. "We're having it Thursday this week," she said. "Petra has a family thing tomorrow." "Then Thursday," he said. He handed her the paper-wrapped packet with the ease of a man who had learned how the market worked and where things were. She took it, and they walked back along the harbor road in the cold, late January light, not touching, not talking much, the city making its sounds around them, the boats coming in on the evening tide, the dark blue letters of the office visible from the harbor road when they turned the corner onto Harbor Lane. She unlocked the door and they went in, and the coal stove was still warm from the afternoon, and Petra had left the desk in order and the lights low, and the harbor was visible through the rear window, the last of the January light going bronze over the water. He put the kettle on because he knew where it was now. She hung her coat because this was her place and the hook was hers. They moved around the small kitchen at the back of the office with the ease of two people who had been doing this long enough that the choreography was natural, and she thought, for a moment, about the gas lamp she had left burning at Ashford Hall on the morning she left, the purposeless light in the empty room. She thought about it without the weight she had carried it with for months, without the grief, or the anger, or the particular sorrow of it. Just the image, clean and finished, the way a thing looked when it was finally fully in the past. She was not that morning anymore. She was this evening, this specific, ordinary, entirely hers evening in the city she had chosen, with the business she had built, with a man who was becoming someone she could trust in increments, through evidence, through the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that added up to a person worth the risk. He handed her the tea. She took it. Outside the window, Port Calvern went about its evening business, indifferent and purposeful, full of the noise of a working city that did not pause for the small and significant things happening inside it. The choices made and unmade, the things survived, the people who had been diminished and had decided, in the specific way that took more courage than any single dramatic act, to rebuild themselves out of the true materials rather than the borrowed ones. She drank her tea. The harbor moved on in the dark, and the life she had made, she painstakingly, at cost, on her own terms, held.